My name is Marissa Caldwell, and I was 45 when my life shattered overnight. I had spent 2 decades building what I thought was a strong marriage, saving every penny for a future we dreamed about together. We had no children, so our vision of retirement was simple. Traveling across the country in an RV, seeing the national parks, drinking coffee by campfires, and holding hands like 2 teenagers who had beaten the odds. But dreams have a cruel way of exposing truth. On a gray Tuesday morning, I logged into our bank account and felt my stomach drop. The balance was near zero. Every cent of our retirement fund, years of careful planning, was gone. And so was my husband, Daniel. He left a note on the counter that simply read, "I need space." At first, I couldn't believe it. Daniel wasn't the type to do something reckless, or at least that's what I had convinced myself over the years. We were high school sweethearts turned middle-aged companions. I thought I knew his habits, his weaknesses, even his lies. But this was betrayal on a scale I couldn't wrap my head around. I sat on the kitchen floor with the note in one hand and my phone in the other, shaking so badly that I could barely dial the bank. The voice on the other end confirmed my worst fear. Daniel had drained every account, even the small savings my parents had left me before they passed. My world collapsed in that moment. I didn't cry right away. Shock froze me in place, as though my body had turned to stone. My mind replayed every dinner conversation, every smile, every promise he had made, and tried to stitch together the warning signs I had ignored. His late nights working, his sudden interest in investment opportunities, his coldness in bed, every clue had been laid before me, but I had chosen to believe in love over logic. I looked around our empty kitchen, the sunlight bouncing off the half-washed dishes, and felt like the universe had played a cruel joke. The man I had trusted with my heart had not only left me, he had stolen my future. The first tears came quietly, almost like a leak in a dam. I pressed my forehead to the cold tile and sobbed until I was gasping for air. Grief bled into rage, and rage sharpened into clarity. Daniel hadn't just abandoned me. He had betrayed the foundation of everything we built. That betrayal carved something new into me. Something fierce. I wiped my face, stood up, and stared at myself in the mirror above the sink. My eyes were red, my hair was unkempt, but in that reflection I saw something I hadn't in years. Strength. I whispered to myself, "You will not be destroyed." That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spin in slow, mocking circles. I thought of all the years I had sacrificed, the career opportunities one passed up to support his ambitions, the weekends I spent alone while he worked late. It all seemed like a lie, a carefully constructed illusion to keep me loyal while he planned his escape. The longer I thought, the more I realized this wasn't just financial theft. It was emotional warfare. Daniel hadn't just left. He had detonated a bomb in the middle of my life and walked away from the ashes. And the cruelest part was that nobody else knew yet. To the world, we were still the perfect couple. Morning came with an emptiness I can't describe. I forced myself out of bed, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the note again. I need space. Those 3 words ignited something bitter inside me. He needed space? After stealing everything? After shattering 20 years of marriage? Space was too kind a word. He needed consequences. I didn't know exactly how, but I vowed in that moment to make him regret every ounce of pain he had caused me. Revenge wasn't my nature, but betrayal had changed me. The woman who once smiled through pain was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone unafraid to fight. The universe must have a twisted sense of timing, because 72 hours later, I got a call that nearly knocked the wind out of me. It was Daniel. His voice was frantic, desperate in a way I had never heard before. He didn't start with an apology or explanation. Instead, his first words were, "Marissa, I need you. Please. They're going to fire me if you don't sign this paperwork." My hand trembled as I held the phone to my ear, my mind spinning with disbelief. The man who had stolen my life savings, the man who walked away without a second glance, was suddenly begging for my help. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until it choked him. In that moment, I realized something. The tables had turned. For the first time in our marriage, I held the power. I could hear the panic in his breathing, the sweat dripping through his words as he tried to explain himself. But I didn't listen. My eyes drifted to the empty chair across from me, the one he had abandoned, and I felt a calmness settle over me. Revenge wasn't going to be about screaming or breaking down. It was going to be about control, about making him feel every ounce of helplessness he had forced upon me. I leaned back in my chair, smiled to myself and said softly, "Daniel, what makes you think I'd save you now?" And with that, the story of my revenge began. I met Daniel Caldwell when I was just 18, a wide-eyed freshman at Ohio State, clutching a second-hand backpack and dreaming of a future bigger than my small-town roots. He was 20, charming in the way boys with crooked smiles and loud laughs often are, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that drew people in. I wasn't naive, I had dated before, but something about him felt different. He noticed me in a crowded cafeteria, walked straight up, and asked to sit at my table. I remember laughing nervously, feeling my cheeks burn, but I said yes. Looking back now, it feels like the beginning of a script I didn't realize I was cast in, one where love blinded me to the kind of man Daniel truly was. We fell hard and fast. Daniel had that restless energy of someone who wanted more from life, who swore he would never settle for mediocrity. At first, I admired it. He made me believe we were destined for greatness, that together we could build something extraordinary. He studied business while I majored in education, and when he talked about opening his own company, I believed every word. By the time we graduated, I had already envisioned the house, the kids we never ended up having, the vacations we'd take. He swept me into his dreams so thoroughly that I stopped building my own. It wasn't that he asked me to, it was that I wanted to or maybe needed to because love felt like enough. Our early years together were a blur of long hours and small victories. Daniel got a job at a local finance firm while I took a teaching position at a nearby elementary school. He worked late, came home smelling of cheap cologne and ambition, and I would stay up waiting with dinner reheated in the oven. Back then, I excused his absences as sacrifice. I told myself, this is what marriage is. Two people working hard for a shared future. On weekends, we would take drives through the countryside and talk about the lake house we would one day buy. He promised me sunsets and security, and I clung to those promises like lifelines. I didn't realize then that promises are only as strong as the man who makes them. By our 10th anniversary, cracks had begun to form. Daniel's career was taking off. Bonuses, recognition, the kind of success that made him puff up with pride. Meanwhile, I was burning out at school, drowning in grading papers, dealing with parents who treated me like a glorified babysitter. When I suggested maybe I go back to school to get a master's, he waved it off, saying we needed to stay practical and focus on his trajectory. He always framed his ambition as ours, his goals as shared goals, and I let myself believe him. Love, I thought, was about compromise. But in truth it was about sacrifice, mine. Things shifted again when we turned 40. Retirement began creeping into conversations, not because it was close, but because Daniel loved to plan. He started researching investments, IRAs, and different funds. I didn't understand much of it, but he reassured me constantly. "Trust me, Marissa," he'd say, his voice full of certainty. "I'm building us something bulletproof. When the time comes, you'll thank me." And I did trust him. I let him handle all the finances, the accounts, the paperwork. He liked being in control, and I liked believing someone had my back. What I didn't know was that he wasn't building security. He was building an escape. Looking back, the signs were there. The nights he came home smelling of wine that wasn't ours. The sudden trips out of town for meetings. The way he began to flinch when I asked simple questions about our accounts. But love, real or imagined, has a way of numbing suspicion. I told myself not to be paranoid. I told myself he had earned his trust, that after 20 years together, doubt was disloyalty. I silenced the small voice inside me that whispered warnings, the one that told me something was off. That silence became my downfall. The day he drained our accounts, the betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just about money, it was about faith. I had given him my whole trust, my whole future, and he had cashed it out like chips at a casino. To learn that he had been planning this, strategizing behind my back, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. And then to hear his voice 3 days later, desperate for me to save his job, was almost laughable. Almost. Except it wasn't funny. It was infuriating. He had taken everything from me, yet somehow still expected me to rescue him. That arrogance, that entitlement, was what pushed me from grief into action. I didn't tell him no right away. That would have been too easy. Instead, I told him I'd think about it. I wanted him squirming, wondering, hoping, while I figured out how to turn the tables completely. Revenge wasn't about quick retaliation, it was about timing, precision, and making sure he felt every ounce of fear and vulnerability he had inflicted on me. I wanted him to know what it was like to stare at a future crumbling to dust. I wanted him to understand what it meant to be powerless. Most of all, I wanted him to remember that it was me, Marissa, the woman he underestimated, who brought him to his knees. When I hung up that phone, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt alive, sharper than I had in years. Every tear I had shed dried into resolve. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat back and began to plan. This wasn't going to be about ruining him financially. No, that was too simple. This was going to be about cutting deeper into his pride, his reputation, his sense of invincibility. I was going to make Daniel Caldwell beg, not just for his job, but for mercy. And I would decide whether he got either. And as I sat there in the quiet of my empty house, I realized something else. I wasn't just seeking revenge. I was reclaiming myself. The woman who had spent 20 years living in Daniel's shadow was gone. In her place was someone new, someone dangerous, someone who finally understood her own worth. And I knew without question that when I was finished, Daniel's betrayal would be the worst mistake of his life. The morning after Daniel's desperate call, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind buzzing like static. For the first time in years, I didn't feel dread in my chest, I felt control. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and began digging. Daniel always prided himself on being careful. But pride makes men sloppy. I logged into old emails he once asked me to print for him, accounts I hadn't touched in years, and suddenly, there it was, a trail of bank transfers, credit card statements, and business correspondence that painted a clear picture. He had been moving money, little by little, into an account I didn't recognize. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft with a strategy. And now, with every click, I was holding evidence that could end him. I called in sick to school that day, though really, I wasn't sick at all. I was alive with adrenaline, piecing together a puzzle Daniel thought I'd never see. By noon, I had a folder thick with documents, screenshots, and transaction histories. My hands trembled as I printed them out, not from fear but from exhilaration. This wasn't just proof of what he'd done. It was leverage. If Daniel needed me to save his job, then he would need me more than ever to bury the evidence I now possessed. The irony made me smile. He had drained our retirement to control his future, and now that very act gave me the power to dictate it. The first call I made wasn't to Daniel. It was to an old friend, Shannon Miller, a lawyer I'd grown close with years ago when we worked on a local school board initiative. Shannon had always been sharp, practical, and most importantly, loyal. I explained the situation, every humiliating detail, and when I finished, there was a pause on the line. "Marissa," she said finally, her voice low and steady, "you're sitting on a gold mine of evidence. He committed marital fraud. You can take him for everything." Her words weren't just comforting. They were electric. For so long I had been Daniel's shadow, and now, I had the power to eclipse him completely. Shannon advised me to sit tight and not confront Daniel directly. "Let him sweat," she said. "The more desperate he gets, the more leverage you'll have." It was exactly what I needed to hear. That night, when Daniel called again, his voice was strained, almost frantic. "Marissa, please, you don't understand. If I don't fix this, I could lose everything. Just meet with me." I let him ramble, then cut in softly. "I'll think about it." And then I hung up. The silence that followed felt like music. For once, I wasn't the one begging. Over the next 2 days, I played my role carefully. I answered some of Daniel's calls, ignored others, and always kept my voice calm, detached. Meanwhile, I kept gathering. I visited the bank, requested official copies of our joint accounts, and discovered that not only had he siphoned off money, but he had also taken out loans in both our names. The betrayal ran deeper than I imagined. But instead of breaking me, each new revelation hardened my resolve. He had gambled our future, and now he was going to pay. Not with money, but with dignity. The first real taste of revenge came when I learned exactly why Daniel needed me. His firm had discovered irregularities in the accounts he managed, and though he had always bragged about being untouchable, they were asking questions he couldn't answer alone. He needed my signature on certain documents to cover his tracks, to make it look as though I had been part of the decision-making. In other words, He wanted me to help him commit fraud, again. The audacity made my blood boil. He had stolen my trust, drained our retirement, left me behind, and now he thought I would risk everything to protect him. That was when my plan crystallized. Instead of rushing to confront him, I began weaving a trap. I scheduled a meeting, but not just with him. Shannon would be nearby, recording everything. I wanted Daniel's desperation on tape, his lies preserved like artifacts, proof of the man behind the mask. The night before the meeting, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied myself. For years I had seen a tired woman, worn down by disappointment. But now, staring back was someone sharp, someone dangerous, someone who finally understood her own power. I smiled. Just a little. Tomorrow, Daniel Caldwell was going to realize he had underestimated the wrong woman. When the day arrived, I dressed carefully. Not flashy, but strong. A navy blazer, black slacks, hair pinned back. The kind of outfit that said I was no longer the wife he had walked out on, but someone entirely new. We met at a coffee shop near downtown, neutral territory. He looked terrible. His once carefully styled hair was messy, his tie askew, dark circles under his eyes. Seeing him like that, disheveled, desperate, was almost intoxicating. "Marissa," he said, standing too quickly, trying to summon his old charm. "Thank you for coming." I sat down without answering, folding my hands neatly on the table. I let the silence stretch until he shifted uncomfortably. Then softly I asked, "Why should I help you?" His explanation tumbled out in a rush. Words about loyalty, about our years together, about how he made mistakes but always meant well. He even tried to play the card of shared history, reminding me of when we were young and dreaming. But every word only fueled the fire inside me. He wasn't sorry. Not really. He was scared. And fear, I realized, was the one thing Daniel had never shown me before. As he begged, his voice cracking, I felt a calm wash over me. For years, I had been the one holding on, clinging to the hope he would change. Now, he was clinging to me, and I was about to let him fall. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "You drained our retirement, Daniel. You lied, you cheated, and you walked away. And now you expect me to save you?" He opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. "I'm not your safety net anymore." His face crumbled, the mask slipping completely, and for a brief second, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered every sleepless night, every sacrifice I made, every time he dismissed my dreams as impractical. And the pity burned away, leaving only resolve. When I walked out of that cafe, Shannon's phone full of recordings, I felt lighter than I had in years. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't the one in control. I was. And soon, the whole world would see the man he really was. The morning after the cafe meeting, I woke up before dawn, my mind thrumming with possibilities. 4 years, Daniel had dictated the rhythm of my life, every decision overshadowed by his ambitions, his pride, his need to control. But now I held something he didn't, a weapon sharper than any betrayal he had inflicted on me. The folder of evidence sat on the kitchen counter like a loaded gun, each document a bullet. I brewed coffee, the bitter scent grounding me, and stared out the window as the first light painted the sky. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking to dread or uncertainty. I was waking to purpose. Today wouldn't just be about survival. Today would be about dismantling Daniel piece by piece until he had nothing left to hide behind. I started with the phone calls. Not to Daniel, but to people who mattered more, to his firm. Using Shannon's advice, I didn't reveal everything at once. Instead, I asked careful questions, playing the role of the concerned, oblivious wife. I just wanted to confirm something, I'd say in a soft, polite voice. Daniel mentioned our accounts were under review. Should I be worried? Their guarded responses told me everything. They were already suspicious. He wasn't just on shaky ground, he was standing on quicksand, and every day I withheld my help was another day he sank deeper. By noon, I had spoken to 3 different managers, each call planting seeds of doubt about Daniel's integrity. Seeds that I knew would grow quickly. Next came the digital trail. Shannon had shown me how to organize everything into a clear timeline. Dates, transfers, loan documents, and email exchanges. Together, we built a dossier that could destroy him both professionally and personally. But Shannon's brilliance was in strategy, not just facts. "We won't give them everything at once," she told me, her tone firm. "We'll leak it in doses. Enough to destabilize him, but not enough to give him a way out. We want him cornered, not fighting back." I listened carefully, absorbing every word. Revenge wasn't just about rage. It was about patience, precision. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to play the game Daniel had always mastered. Only now the rules were mine. That evening, Daniel showed up at my doorstep. He looked worse than before. Rumpled suit, hollow eyes, the swagger that once defined him replaced by a twitchy desperation. "Marissa, please," he said as soon as I opened the door, his voice cracking. "You don't understand how serious this is. If you don't help me, I could lose everything." I let him in, but only because I wanted him to see what losing everything looked like. The folder lay open on the coffee table, its contents neatly spread out. His eyes widened as he recognized the documents. How did you, he stammered, his face draining of color. I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned back, folded my arms, and let the silence crush him. He tried everything. Pleading, threatening, even promising he would come back to me if I just cooperated. The irony of it nearly made me laugh. For years, I had begged him to stay present, to love me, to share a life with me. And now here he was, dangling the very thing he had thrown away as though it were a bargaining chip. "You don't get it, Daniel," I said finally, my voice steady and cold. "This isn't about saving you. This is about saving myself. And trust me, I don't need you for that." The look in his eyes shifted then, panic giving way to realization. For the first time, he understood that I was no longer his. The next day, I sent an anonymous packet of documents to his firm's compliance department. Just a taste, one bank statement showing irregular transfers, one email chain that hinted at conflicts of interest. It wasn't enough to indict him, but it was enough to ignite suspicion into full-blown alarm. Within hours, Daniel called me again, his voice shaking. "What did you do?" "They're talking about a formal investigation." I didn't bother to hide my satisfaction. "Maybe you should have thought about that before draining our retirement," I replied coolly, then hung up. Each click of the phone was like closing a door he could never reopen. Meanwhile, I began reclaiming pieces of myself that I hadn't touched in years. I rejoined the local community choir, something Daniel always dismissed as a waste of time. I called old friends, women who had stopped inviting me out because they knew Daniel would always find a way to decline on my behalf. Slowly, I started rebuilding not just my independence but my identity. Every step forward felt like erasing a little more of his shadow. And every time Daniel's world unraveled, mine grew brighter, steadier. The contrast was intoxicating. By the end of the week, Shannon had drafted the beginnings of a divorce petition, one that would not only separate us legally but financially devastate him. "With this evidence, we'll ensure he's left with nothing he can use against you," she explained. It wasn't just paperwork, it was liberation in ink. I imagined Daniel sitting in his sterile office, realizing his empire was crumbling, that the woman he once dismissed as weak and dependent was now the architect of his downfall. That image alone fueled me through sleepless nights. The final move of that week came unexpectedly. I received a voicemail late one evening. Not from Daniel, but from one of his colleagues at the firm. Her voice was shaky, almost nervous. "Marissa, I don't know how much you know, but there are things about Daniel. Things that could hurt more than just you." She didn't say much else, only that she wanted to meet in person. As I listened, my pulse quickened. I had thought I already knew the worst of Daniel's betrayals. But this message hinted at something deeper, darker. Something that went beyond our marriage and even beyond money. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, staring into the dark. What more could there be? What secrets was Daniel still hiding, even as his life collapsed around him? The thought both terrified and thrilled me. Because if there were more skeletons in his closet, I was determined to drag them out into the light. And this time, I wouldn't just watch him crumble. I would make sure the world saw him for what he truly was. The next morning, I drove across town to meet the woman who had left the voicemail. Her name was Clarissa Vaughn, one of Daniel's junior partners at the firm. We met at a small diner off the interstate, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of bacon grease lingering in the air. Clarissa looked younger than me, mid-30s maybe, but her eyes told a different story. eyes burdened by secrets too heavy for her age. As she stirred her coffee, her hands trembled, and I realized this wasn't a casual meeting. She wasn't here to gossip about Daniel. She was here to confess something that could change everything. "Your husband," she began softly, "isn't just reckless with money. He's dangerous." Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking me. I leaned forward, gripping my mug, waiting for her to continue. Clarissa explained that Daniel had been manipulating more than our personal savings. He had been siphoning money from the firm itself, orchestrating shell companies, and funneling client funds into accounts hidden overseas. "He used you, Marissa," she said, her voice breaking. "Your name, your signature, your credit. He tied you into this without you even knowing. If this comes to light, they won't just come for him. They'll come for you too." My stomach twisted. The betrayal was deeper than I'd imagined. It wasn't just about draining our retirement anymore. Daniel had turned me into a pawn in his crimes, a shield to protect himself. I sat there frozen, every nerve in my body screaming with disbelief and rage. Clarissa slid a folded paper across the table. Printouts of bank transfers, some with my name tied to authorization codes I'd never seen before. "He forged your signature," she whispered. "But the system won't care. On paper, you're complicit." My hands shook as I scanned the documents. Daniel hadn't just abandoned me. He had framed me to take the fall if his empire crumbled. Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him that power anymore. Clarissa looked at me with pity. "You need to protect yourself before this explodes." "I can't help much. I could lose everything, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." She left quickly, leaving me alone with the evidence that my husband's betrayal was even more monstrous than I had believed. Driving home, the world outside blurred into a haze of headlights and rain. Every memory of Daniel now felt tainted, poisoned by this new truth. All the times he smiled, told me he was doing everything for us, all the moments he held my hand while plotting his schemes behind my back, it made my skin crawl. But beneath the horror, something else burned hotter. Resolve. If Daniel thought he could use me as his scapegoat, he had underestimated me once again. He might have orchestrated the game, but I was learning fast, and I had weapons of my own now. Shannon's voice echoed in my mind. "Corner him, don't crush him yet. Make him desperate enough to unravel himself." And now I had the perfect bait. When Daniel showed up at my doorstep again 2 nights later, I was ready. He looked worse, his tie crooked, his skin sallow, desperation written in every twitch of his face. "Marissa," he said breathlessly, "they're on to me. I just need time. If you'll sign a few documents for me, I can fix this." He held out a folder, and the audacity nearly made me laugh. He was still trying to use me as his shield. "Sign what?" I asked calmly, though my heart pounded in my chest. He stammered, "Just routine authorizations. Nothing serious. Please, if you love me, if you ever cared about us, you'll help me." That word, love, curdled in my ears. I let him sweat as I pretended to consider. Finally I said, "Leave the papers. I'll look them over." He relaxed slightly, mistaking hesitation for weakness. He had no idea the trap I was about to set. After he left, I called Shannon and told her everything Clarissa had revealed. I could hear the sharp inhale of her breath. "He's not just reckless, he's criminal," she said firmly. "We're not just talking divorce anymore. This could land him in prison. But if you're tied to these accounts, you'll need to prove he forged your involvement." My chest tightened. Prison. The word felt both terrifying and delicious. The thought of Daniel locked away, powerless, stripped of his charm and arrogance. It was almost too satisfying to imagine. Shannon outlined our next move. We'd gather every forged document, compile expert handwriting analyses, and create a trail proving Daniel had orchestrated everything. It would be dangerous, but with Clarissa's evidence and Shannon's legal expertise, I finally felt like the walls Daniel built around me were crumbling. But as I prepared myself for this war, a small part of me hesitated. What if Clarissa was only telling half the story? What if she was protecting herself while handing me just enough to burn Daniel? I thought back to the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. No, she wasn't lying. She was terrified because she knew how ruthless Daniel could be. And if he realized she had spoken to me, she would be in as much danger as I was. That realization lit a fire inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. For me, for Clarissa, and for anyone else who had been tangled in Daniel's web of lies. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, plotting my next move. I couldn't simply hand the evidence over and hope the system would protect me. Daniel was too clever, too manipulative. He'd twist the narrative, paint me as the unstable wife, the bitter woman lashing out after being left. No, I had to control the story. I had to expose him in a way that left no room for his lies. And I knew just how to do it. My plan would not just destroy his career. It would strip him of his reputation, his allies, and his carefully crafted mask of respectability. By the time I was finished, Daniel would be a man the world turned its back on, begging for mercy he would never receive. As the clock ticked past midnight, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not letters. Not petitions. A confession. Only it wasn't mine. It was Daniel's. Using the documents Clarissa had given me as a guide, I drafted a detailed account of his schemes, written as though it came directly from him. The fake confession outlined every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every deception. It was damning, airtight. By the time I finished, my fingers ached, but my heart raced with anticipation. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was a weapon, sharp and ready to be unleashed. And when the time was right, Daniel wouldn't know what hit him. But as I saved the file and shut the laptop, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. My own eyes stared back at me, fierce and unflinching. For years, I had been the quiet, dutiful wife, bending under the weight of Daniel's lies. Now, I was something else entirely. A woman reborn in fire and betrayal. A woman who wasn't just fighting back. She was rewriting the story. And as much as Daniel had hurt me, as much as he had stolen from me, he had given me this one gift without realizing it. The strength to become his greatest downfall. The morning after drafting the confession, I woke up with a pounding heart, the kind that comes not from fear but from anticipation. The sun cut across my blinds in sharp stripes, and for the first time in months, I felt clarity. My plan wasn't just an idea. It was a storm waiting to break. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping black coffee, staring at the manila folder Daniel had left for me. Inside were the documents he wanted me to sign, the very news he thought he could slip around my neck without me noticing. I almost laughed at the arrogance. But instead of signing, I began making copies, scanning every page, saving each file to encrypted drives. Then I slipped them back into the folder as if untouched. Daniel would believe I was still wavering. He would never see the knife I was holding behind my back. The first person I shared my draft with was Shannon. I brought her to my kitchen, locked the doors, and slid the laptop across to her. She read silently, her eyes scanning every word. With each sentence, her lips tightened, her jaw set, and finally, she closed the laptop with a snap. "This," she said, her voice low but firm, "is brilliant. It's risky, but it's brilliant." I leaned forward. "Do you think it will hold? Do you think people will believe it?" She shook her head. "Marissa, they won't just believe it. They'll devour it. But we can't release it as is. It needs supporting evidence, things only Daniel would know, details that make it undeniable." My stomach dropped, because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life, into the shadows he thought I could never reach. That night, I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. The air was stale, smelling faintly of his cologne, the one I used to love. His leather chair sat like a throne before the desk, the place where he must have plotted all his betrayals. I opened drawers, rifled through folders, and my breath caught when I found a slim black notebook hidden beneath stacks of financial journals. Inside were scribbled notes, dates, account numbers, phone call reminders. His handwriting, his shorthand, his secrets. One entry froze me, Cayman transfer, use M's signature if questioned. My blood ran cold. It was undeniable proof he had forged me into his schemes. My hands shook as I snapped photos of every page. For the first time, I wasn't just his wife uncovering betrayal. I was his executioner, piecing together his downfall. The next morning, Shannon helped me weave these details into the fake confession. Dates from his notebook, language he often used in emails, the kind of phrasing that would sound distinctly like him. It was terrifying how quickly the puzzle fit together, how easily I could slip into his voice. But it was also empowering. Every sentence I wrote was like driving another nail into the coffin of the man who had stolen my future. By the end of the day, the document was airtight. Shannon leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This isn't just a weapon, Marissa. This is nuclear. I stared at the pages glowing on the screen, a strange calm settling over me. I didn't just want Daniel ruined. I wanted him exposed, stripped bare for the world to see, no mask, no charm, just the monster he really was. 2 days later, Daniel showed up again, pounding on my door. His hair was unkempt, his tie missing, desperation carved into his face. Marissa, open the door. His voice cracked. I waited a full minute before unlocking it, just long enough to remind him who held the power now. When I finally opened it, his eyes darted past me, searching. The papers. Have you signed them? His voice was frantic, his hands shaking. I forced myself to stay calm, to tilt my head in feigned confusion. I'm still looking them over, I said coolly. His face darkened. There's no time. Do you understand what's at stake? I let silence stretch, then smiled faintly. Oh, I think I understand better than you think. For a flicker of a moment, suspicion crossed his face, but he shoved it down, too consumed by panic to see the trap closing. After he left, I put the next part of my plan into motion. I created anonymous email accounts, drafted cover letters, and attached the confession alongside supporting documents. The first recipients: investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The second: key board members of Daniel's firm. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as I prepared myself for this window with a glass of wine, a small part of me hesitated. Watching the rain streak down the glass. Clarissa was only telling half the story. First with a news alert. What if she was protecting herself while handing me just enough to burn Daniel? Like embezzlement, I thought back to the fear in her eyes, and anonymous whistleblower in her voice flashed across my screen. No, she wasn't lying. My heart pounded as I clicked one of the headlines because she knew how ruthless Daniel could be. Under investigation, and if he realized she had spoken to me, she would be in as much danger as I was. My creation. That realization lit a fire inside me. And the world was eating it alive. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Quoted the confession verbatim. It was about survival. Dissecting every damning detail. And for anyone else who had been tangled in Daniel's golden advisor he had once been. That night, but as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, plotting my next move. Soft at first, I couldn't simply hand the evidence over and hope the system would protect me. Daniel was too release, of victory, too manipulative, of justice clawing its way to the surface. Paint me as the unstable wife. Next, the bitter woman lashing out after being calling over and over. No, I had to control the story angrily across my screen. I had to expose him in a way that left no room for his lies. Then Shannon called, and I knew just how to do it. My plan would not just destroy his career. He's finished. It would strip him of his reputation, distancing themselves already, and his carefully crafted emergency respectability. He's radioactive. By the time I was finished, Daniel would be a man the world turned its back on. The words, begging for mercy he would never receive. Daniel had held power over me. As the clock ticked past silencing midnight, me with charm, I opened my laptop and began writing. Now the world was finally seeing him for what he was. And there was no going back. Only it wasn't mine. I knew the war wasn't over. You wouldn't go down quietly. Had given me as a guide. Daniel was a man who thrived on survival, account of his schemes, on twisting the narrative to his favor, directly from him. And if he thought I was the one holding the knife, outlined every forged signature, come for me with everything he had left, every deception. Late that night, as the storm raged outside, airtight. I heard it. By the time I finished, knock at my door. Fingers ached. This time, but my heart raced with anticipation. My stomach just evidence anymore. When I opened it, this was a Daniel weapon, stood there, sharp and ready to be unleashed, eyes hollow. And when the time was right, barely a whisper, Daniel wouldn't know what hit him. But as I saved the file and shut the laptop, was the arrogance. I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. My own eyes stared back at me, a man stripped of his armor, fierce and unflinching. But I didn't feel pity. For years, I had been the quiet, dutiful wife. I crossed my arms, bending under the weight against the frame, letting the silence stretch between us entirely. Finally, a woman reborn in fire and betrayal. Daniel. A woman who wasn't just fighting back. You listen. She was rewriting the story. It's my turn to decide what happens next. As much as he had stolen from me, his eyes widened, and in that instant, one gift I knew he understood. The strength to become his greatest downfall. The morning after drafting the confession, and I was far from finished writing his ending. The kind that comes not from fear but from anticipation. He just stood there in the rain, cut across my blinds in sharp stripes. and for the first time in months, as if he had run miles, I felt clarity. But his eyes, my plan wasn't just an idea. With a wild mix of rage and desperation to break. You think you sat at my kitchen table, his voice sipping black coffee, trembling on the edge of collapse. Staring at the manila folder Daniel had left for me. But you don't understand, Marissa. Inside were the documents he wanted me to sign. You go with me. The very news he thought he could slip around my neck without me noticing. But I didn't move. I almost laughed at the arrogance. Those kinds of threats had paralyzed me. I began making copies that I was tethered to his mess forever. Every page, but now, saving each file to in the doorway with the storm at my back. Then I slipped them back into the folder as if untouched. I wasn't afraid anymore. Daniel would believe I was still wavering. Nothing but smoke. He would never see the knife I was holding behind my back. Then burn with me. The first person I shared my draft with was Shannon. I'm not going down. I brought her to my kitchen. He stepped closer and slid the laptop scattering onto my hardwood floor. She read silently. You don't know who you're playing with, scanning every word, voice rising. With each sentence, trying to claw back her lips tightened, her jaw set, and finally, if they don't get what they want, the laptop with a snap. They'll come after me. This, she said, and if they think you're holding the strings firm, they'll come after you too. It's risky, but the weight of his words pressed against me. I leaned forward. For a split second, do you think it will hold? Doubt flickered in my chest. Do you think people will believe it? Was this bigger than just him? She shook her head. Were there others? Marissa, shadows behind his betrayal. Believe it, waiting to collect. They'll devour it. But then I remembered the notebook, release it as the evidence, the power in my hands. Supporting evidence. He wanted me to feel Daniel would know, but fear was his weapon, make it undeniable. Not mine. I took a deep breath and said, because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life, drained our retirement into the shadows he thought I could never reach. His face twisted in fury. I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. Then slowly closed the door in his face, smelling faintly of his cologne against it, the one I used to love, rattling through my bones. His leather chair sat like a throne before the desk. Don't do this. The place where he must have plotted all his betrayals. His voice cracked. I opened drawers, rifled through folders, but I locked the deadbolt when I found a slim black notebook hidden beneath stacks of financial journals. With clarity, inside were scribbled notes. The storm outside matched the storm inside account numbers, but I was no longer drowning in it. His handwriting, another glass of wine, shorthand, sat by the window, secrets, and watched his silhouette finally retreat down the driveway, swallowed by the rain. Signature of question. I knew this wasn't the end. My blood ran cold. It was just the start of his retaliation. It was undeniable proof he had forged me into. And I had to be read his schemes. Because Daniel wasn't the type to surrender. I snapped photos of every page. He was the type to claw, scratch, and destroy everything in his path until he got what he wanted. I was his executioner. The retaliation began. Together his downfall. First, with a call from my bank, Shannon helped me weave these details into the fake confession. His voice uncertain. Dates from his notebook. We received a request to freeze your account pending a fraud investigation. The kind of phrasing that would sound distinctly like cold. It was terrifying how quickly the puzzle fit together. He was already trying to twist the narrative into his voice, painting me as the criminal. But it was also empowering. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone. Every sentence I wrote was like driving another nail into the coffin of the man who had stolen my future. Proving my identity over and over again. The document was airtight. By the time the mess was temporarily back in her chair, I was shaking with rage. This isn't just a weapon, wasn't just fighting back. He was trying to ruin me, piece by piece. I stared at the pages glowing on the screen, vulnerable and desperate enough to calm settling over me. But he underestimated one thing. I didn't just want Daniel ruined. I wasn't the same woman who once depended on him, stripped bare for the world to someone else. No mask, someone willing to fight with every ounce of fire left in her. 2 days later, Daniel showed up again, her face pale, pounding on my door. His hair was news updates, his media frenzy circling Daniel like vultures into his face. He's dangerous right now, open the door, she said, pacing my kitchen. Cracked. Cornered men I waited a full minute before unlocking it. You need to stay one step ahead. To remind him who held the power now. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. His eyes darted trying to take me down, searching, freezing accounts, spreading lies. Have you signed them? His voice was frantic. Shannon stopped shaking. Her eyes sharp. I forced myself to stay calm. Don't wait for to tilt my head in feigned confusion. Harder. I'm still looking them over, to bury him. Coolly. Leak the rest, his face darkened. Every single piece. There's no time. Don't just expose him as a fraud. What's at stake? Expose him as the coward who used his wife as a shield. Then smiled faintly. Sank deep into me. I think I understand better than you think. To survive his betrayal. For a flicker of a moment, now it was time to flip the script, to stop surviving and start destroying. Too consumed by panic to see the trap closing. After he left, I put the next part of my plan into motion. I created anonymous email accounts, drafted cover letters, and attached the confession alongside supporting documents. The first recipients: investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The second: key board members of Daniel's firm. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as I prepared myself for this war, spreading out every shred of evidence I had collected. What if Clarissa was only telling half the story? Photos of the notebook. What if she was protecting herself while handing me just enough to burn Daniel? Each piece was like a shard of glass. I thought back to the fear in her eyes. Damning. The urgency in her voice. To a secure drive. No, she wasn't another lying. Round of emails. She was terrified this time not because she knew how ruthless Daniel could be, but to law enforcement and if he realized she had spoken to Daniel wanted a war, she would be in as much danger as I was. The battlefield into that realization lit a fire inside me. As I hit send on the first wave, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. A strange calm washed over me. It was about survival. For the first time in months, for Clarissa, I didn't feel like the one running who had been tangled in Daniel's web of lies. And the world was closing in. I lay awake in bed. The next morning, staring at the ceiling, news outlets exploded with fresh details. I couldn't simply hand the evidence over and hope the system would protect me. Forged signatures. Daniel was too clever. And a paper trail that painted Daniel as more than just reckless. He'd twist the narrative. He was criminal. Paint me as the unstable wife on every screen. The bitter woman lashing out after being left. Now haunted and cornered. I had to control the story. Calls from his allies began flooding in a way that begging left for no room for his lies, demanding answers. And I knew just how to do it. I sat in my living room, would not just destroy watching his it all unfold like a front row spectator of his reputation, public execution, his allies, and his carefully crafted mask of respectability. Because men like Daniel didn't crumble quietly. Daniel would be a man the world turned its back on, and I had no doubt he was already plotting his next move. As the clock ticked past midnight, I opened my laptop and began writing. This time, it wasn't Shannon or a bank or a reporter. It was my mother. Her voice was shaky. Marissa Daniels. A man came by the house earlier. Clarissa had given me as a guide. I drafted a detailed account of his schemes, but he left a card, written as though it came directly from him. My blood froze. The fake confession outlined every forged signature, far removed from the chaos of my marriage's collapse. I drove over immediately, and when my mother handed me the card, my fingers ached, knotted, but my heart raced with anticipation. But the name of a law firm I recognized. This wasn't just evidence anymore. One known for brutal takedowns and smear campaigns, ready to be unleashed. Daniel had hired them, and when the time was right, this wasn't just about fighting me in the shadows anymore. But as I saved the file and shut me into court, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. Every part of my life into ammunition. My own eyes stared back at me, driving back fierce home, and unflinching. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Dutiful wife. Fear prickled at me, bending under the weight of Daniel's lies. A stronger current surged. I was something else entirely. If Daniel thought he could weaponize the law against me, he hadn't yet realized the depth of my resolve. She was rewriting the story, allies, and as much as Daniel no longer possessed, as much as he had stolen from me. But I also knew this would be the hardest battle without realizing it. Courtrooms weren't places of emotion or catharsis. They were places of strategy, manipulation, I woke up and the pounding calculation, the kind that comes not from fear but from anticipation. I'd give him one. The sun cut across my blinds in sharp to survive it. And for the first time in months, him so I felt clarity that he would never crawl out of the wreckage. My plan wasn't just an idea. That night, it was as I sat in waiting to break, exhaustion pressing down on my kitchen table. I realized something chilling. Staring at the manila folder Daniel had left anymore. Inside were the documents he wanted reputation or survival. The very news he thought he could slip around my neck without me noticing. He couldn't stand the idea of me walking away laughed at the arrogance of me holding power over him. But instead of signing, this wasn't about the retirement he drained or the job he was losing. Saving each file to refusing to let me win. Then I slid them back into the folder as I hadn't even imagined. Daniel would believe I was still softly outside. He would never see the knife I was holding behind my back. You wanted to break me, Daniel. The first person I shared my draft with was Shannon. I brought her to my kitchen, locked the doors, but I wasn't the one who needed to be afraid anymore. She read silently. The courtroom smelled of old wood and cold air. With each sentence, where lives were unraveled and sewn back together under fluorescent lights. And finally, she closed the laptop with a snap. My hand steady on the polished surface, her voice low but firm. Though my heart is brilliant with relentless force. It's risky, across the aisle. Daniel adjusted his tie. His face pale but sharpened with arrogance. Do you think people will believe it? A sleek man with a viper smile whispered in his ear. They won't just believe it. Daniel gave the smallest nod. They'll devour it. Like he still believed he held the upper hand. But we can't release it as is. I studied him. It needs supporting evidence. The bags under his eyes. Only Daniel would know. In his jaw. Details that make it undeniable. And this room would tear at every loose thread. Because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life. Into the shadows he thought I could never reach. Let the evidence speak. That night, I nodded. I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. This wasn't just about I'd been in there since he left. It was about justice. The air was stale. About showing him he could never crush me again. The one I used to love. The judge entered, and his leather chair sat like a throne. The proceedings began swiftly. The place where he must have Daniel's attorney wasted no time. I opened drawers, he began, rifled through folders, oily smooth, and my breath caught when I found a slim black notebook betrayal beneath stacks of financial journals. Scorned. Inside were revenge against her husband for personal grievances, account numbers. We will show that Mrs. Caldwell has twisted his handwriting, fabricated documents, and launched a smear campaign designed to destroy a man's career. Cayman transfer. Use M signature if questioned. But I didn't flinch. My blood ran cold. I knew this strategy. It was undeniable
into
proof
the villain,
he had forged
a
me
bitter
into
wife
his driven by spite. My hands
But
shook
they
as I snapped
underestimated
photos
me.
of every page.
They didn't know how much
For the
truth
first
I
time,
carried.
I wasn't
How
just
sharp
his
it
wife
cut.
uncovering betrayal.
When my lawyer rose,
I was his
voice was
executioner,
steady, clear,
piecing
and
together
strong.
his downfall.
Your Honor,
the next morning,
what we present today
Shannon
is
helped
not
me read
revenge.
these details into
It
the
is
fake
reality.
confession.
And
Dates from his
reality has a
notebook,
paper trail.
language he often used
He
in
placed
emails,
the first stack of
the kind of
documents on the
phrasing
table
that would
with
sound
deliberate
distinctly
weight.
like him.
Like laying
It
bricks
was
in the
terrifying
foundation
how
of
quickly the
Daniel's
puzzle fit
downfall.
together. The first
How
witness
easily
was
I could
called
slip into his
a
voice.
financial analyst
But
who
it
had
was also
reviewed Daniel's
empowering.
accounts. Every sentence I
walked the
wrote
jury
was
through
like
transfers,
driving another nail into
withdrawals,
the coffin
and
of the man
offshore
who had
deposits.
stolen my future.
His voice steady,
By the
his
end of the
language
day,
precise.
the document
I
was
watched the
airtight.
jurors' faces as
Shannon
they listened,
leaned back in her
their
chair,
expressions shifting from
exhaling.
confusion to disbelief
This isn't
to
just a
quiet
weapon,
outrage.
Marissa. Numbers
This
didn't
is
lie,
nuclear.
and the
I
numbers
stared
painted
at the pages
Daniel as a
glowing on the
thief.
screen.
I glanced at him across the aisle
over me.
His jaw
I
was
didn't
tight.
just want Daniel
his hands
ruined.
clenched into fists
I wanted him
beneath the table.
exposed.
He
Stripped
knew
bare
this
for
was
the world to
damning,
see,
but his
no
pride
mask,
wouldn't let
no
him show
charm.
fear. Just the monster
Still,
he really
I could
was.
see it. The
2 days
smallest
later,
twitch at the corner of
Daniel
his
showed
mouth,
up again,
the subtle
pounding
tremor
on
in
my
his leg.
door.
For the
His
first
hair was
time,
unkempt,
I felt the scales
his tie
tipping,
missing,
not just in the
desperation
courtroom,
carved into
but in
his
my
face.
life.
For
Marissa,
once,
open
he was
the
the one
door.
being exposed,
His voice
stripped
cracked.
of his illusions.
I waited a full
forced to
minute
stand
before
naked in
unlocking
front of
it,
the truth, just long enough to remind him who held the power now. When I finally opened it, his eyes darted past me, searching. The papers. Have you signed them? His voice was frantic, his hands shaking. I forced myself to stay calm, to tilt my head in feigned confusion. I'm still looking them over, I said coolly. His face darkened. There's no time. Do you understand what's at stake? I let silence stretch, then smiled faintly. Oh, I think I understand better than you think. For a flicker of a moment, suspicion crossed his face, but he shoved it down, too consumed by panic to see the trap closing. After he left, I put the next part of my plan into motion. I created anonymous email accounts, drafted cover letters, and attached the confession alongside supporting documents. The first recipients: investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The second: key board members of Daniel's firm. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as
Daniel
I prepared
wasn't
myself
done.
for this war,
When it was
a
his
small
turn,
part of me
he
hesitated.
leaned into his performance
What
like
if
an
Clarissa
actor on
was only
stage?
telling half the
He
story?
painted himself as the
What if
victim
she
of
was protecting
circumstance?
herself while
A man
handing me
driven
just
to
enough
desperate
to burn
measures by
Daniel?
financial hardship
I thought
and
back to the
stress.
fear in her eyes.
He spoke of me as
the
if I were
urgency
cold,
in her voice.
unsupportive.
No,
Someone
she
who had
wasn't
abandoned
lying.
him emotionally
She
long
was
before he
terrified
ever
because
touched
she
our
knew how
retirement
ruthless
account.
Daniel could be.
I made mistakes,
and if he
he said.
realized she had
His
spoken
voice
to me,
quivering just
she
enough
would
to
be
seem
in as
human.
much danger as
But
I was.
I never intended
that
to hurt her.
realization lit a
I
fire
loved
inside
her.
me. His attorney
wasn't
let
just
silence
about
stretch,
revenge anymore.
as if to let the
It was
jury
about
soak in his
survival.
supposed
For me,
vulnerability.
for Clarissa,
my stomach
and for
turned.
anyone else who had been
He was
tangled in
weaponizing
Daniel's
love
web
of lies,
twisting it into
that
a
night,
shield.
I lay awake
wanted
in
to
bed,
scream,
staring
to
at the
stand
ceiling,
and shout the truth.
plotting my next move.
But I stayed still.
I couldn't
my
simply
lawyer's
hand the
hand
evidence
resting
over
gently on
and
my
hope
arm,
the system would protect
reminding
me.
me,
Daniel was
patience.
too clever.
Truth doesn't
too
need
manipulative.
theatrics.
He
Truth
twists the
just needs
narrative.
time.
Paint me as
Then
the
it was my
unstable
turn.
wife. The
I
bitter
rose
woman
slowly,
lashing out after
every
being
eye
left.
in the room following
No,
me.
I had to control
I took
the
the stand.
story. My palms
I had to
damp,
expose him
my
in a
chest
way that
tight.
left no room
The
for his
attorney
lies.
fired his questions
And I
like
knew
darts,
just how to do it.
each one designed
My
to trap
plan
me.
would not just destroy
Mrs.
his
Caldwell,
career.
Isn't
would
it
strip
true
him
that
of
you
his
sent
reputation,
emails to journalists
his allies,
before this trial?
and his carefully
Isn't it
crafted
true that
mask
you've
of
made every
respectability?
effort to ruin your
By the
husband's
time I was
career?
finished,
I
Daniel
kept my
would be a
voice
man the
steady.
world turned its back
I sent
on.
the truth,
Begging for mercy
if that
he would
ruins
never
his
receive.
career.
As
As
the
the clock
his
ticked
actions
past
ruined
midnight
it first.
I opened my laptop
smirked,
and began writing,
circling me like a
not
predator.
letters. And how
Not
can the jury be
petitions.
sure you didn't
A
alter these
confession.
documents? Only it wasn't
After all,
mine.
you had access
it was
to them.
Daniel's. My eyes
Using
locked
the
on the
documents
jurors.
Clarissa had given me
because
as a
the truth
guide,
doesn't need
I drafted
altering.
a detailed account
and
of
you'll
his
see that
schemes,
today,
written as though
the
it
room
came
was
directly
silent,
from him.
Heavy
The
with
fake
tension.
confession outlined
I could
every
feel the
forged
jury weighing
signature,
my words,
every stolen
measuring
dollar,
them against
every
his
deception.
lies.
It
Piece
was
by
damning,
piece, I laid it
airtight.
bare. By the
I
time
spoke
I
of the day
finished,
I discovered
my
the
fingers
empty
ached.
accounts,
But my
the
heart
cold
raced
silence
with
of the retirement
anticipation.
funds we had spent
This wasn't
decades
just
saving
evidence
for.
anymore.
I told them about
This
the
was a
nights I
weapon,
cried alone,
sharp and ready
the
to be
morning I found the
unleashed.
notebook that
And when the
unraveled
time
his
was
entire
right,
scheme.
Daniel wouldn't
I
know what
described
hit
the fear,
him.
the betrayal,
But as I
and
saved the
finally,
file
the
and shut
result
the
that led
laptop.
here.
I caught my reflection in the darkened screen, not with
my
weakness,
own eyes stared
but
back
with
at me.
honesty, fierce
I
and
wanted them to
unflinching.
feel it.
For
Not
years,
just the theft of money,
I had been the
but the
quiet,
theft of
dutiful
trust.
wife, the way he had
Bending
hollowed
under
out
the
the very
weight of
foundation
Daniel's
of our
lies.
lives together. Now,
As
I
I
spoke,
something else entirely.
I saw something shift
A
in the
woman
jury's
reborn in
eyes.
fire and betrayal.
Empathy. A woman who
Recognition.
wasn't just fighting
They
back.
weren't just hearing a
she
story.
was rewriting the
They
story.
were living it with me.
And as much as Daniel
And I
had
knew
hurt
then
me,
that Daniel's
as much
mask
as he had
was
stolen
slipping
from me,
no matter how hard
he had
he
given
clung
me
to
this
it.
one gift
By
without
the end of the
realizing
day,
it.
the
The
courtroom
strength to
buzzed
become
with
his greatest
tension.
downfall.
Both sides
The morning
had laid
after
down
drafting
their
the
opening
confession,
salvos.
I woke
and
up
the weight
with a
of
pounding
evidence
heart,
hung thick in
the
the
kind
air.
that comes not
The
from
judge
fear
called
but from
for recess,
anticipation.
and I stepped
the
outside,
sun cut across my
breathing
blinds
in the
in
sharp
sharp
autumn air.
stripes.
And for the
Shannon
first
met
time
me
on
months.
the courthouse
I
steps,
felt clarity.
her eyes fierce.
My plan wasn't just
"You
an
nailed
idea,
it," she said.
It was a storm
"You
waiting
showed
to
them
break.
who he really is."
I sat at my kitchen
I
table,
nodded,
sipping
though
black
exhaustion
coffee,
pressed heavy on my
staring at the
bones.
manila folder
"It's
Daniel
not
had left
over,"
for me. I whispered.
Inside were the
"He'll
documents he
fight
wanted me
harder.
to sign.
He always
The very
does.
news he thought he
She
could slip
squeezed
around
my
my neck
hand.
without me noticing.
Then so will you.
I almost laughed
Her
at
words
the
anchored
arrogance.
me.
A
But
reminder
instead
that
of
this
signing,
wasn't just
I began
about winning
making
copies.
copies. It was
Scanning
about
every
reclaiming
page,
my life, my
saving
power,
each
my
file to
freedom.
encrypted drives.
The battle wasn't finished.
Then I slipped them
but for
back
the first
into the
time,
folder as
I
if
believed
untouched.
the ending could finally
Daniel
be mine
would
to
believe
write.
I was still wavering.
As I drove home, he would never
Headlights
see the
streaking
knife I
across
was
the dark
holding
and
behind
roads.
my back.
I thought of Daniel
the first
alone
person
in
I
whatever
shared my
hotel room
draft
he had
with
slunk
was
into.
Shannon.
I
Plotting his
brought her
next
to my
move.
kitchen.
He would
locked
come
the
at me
doors,
with everything
and
he
slid
had
the
left.
laptop across to her.
Money,
She
lawyers,
read silently.
lies.
Her
But I
eyes
wasn't
scanning
that
every
fragile
word.
woman anymore.
With each sentence,
I was steel
her lips
forged in
tightened,
betrayal,
her jaw set,
fire hardened
and finally,
by grief.
she closed
And
the
when
laptop
this was
with
a
over.
snap, he wouldn't
This,
just
she
lose
said,
a case.
her voice low but
he would
firm.
lose the power
It's
he had
brilliant.
lorded over me
It's
for years.
risky, but it's
I
brilliant.
whispered to the empty car.
I leaned forward.
You took everything
Do you
from me
think it will
once.
hold?
But this
Do you
time,
think
Daniel,
people will
I'm
believe
taking
it?
it all back.
She shook her head.
The road stretched ahead like a promise.
They won't just
and for the
believe
first
it.
time,
They'll
I felt like
devour
I was
it.
finally
But
driving
we
toward
can't
freedom.
release it as
The
is.
trial had paused
It
for the
needs
weekend.
supporting evidence,
but Daniel
things
never
only
stopped
Daniel would
fighting.
know. That
Details
much
that
became
made clear the
undeniable.
moment I woke Saturday morning
My
to the sound of my
stomach dropped,
phone buzzing
because
with
that meant I'd
unknown
have to
numbers.
dig deeper into his
Dozens
life,
of missed calls,
into the shadows
text
he thought I could
messages,
never reach.
and emails crowded
That
my
night,
screen.
I
Each
crept
one
into
designed
Daniel's
to rattle
abandoned
me.
study.
Some were cruel.
It was the first time I'd
Anonymous
been in there
messages
since he
calling me a
left.
liar and a
The
gold
air was
digger.
stale.
Others
Smelling
were thinly
thinly
veiled
veiled his
threats.
cologne, the
Warning
one I
me
used to love.
drop the case before
His
it
leather
destroys
chair
you.
sat like a throne before
My
the
stomach
desk.
nodded.
The place
but
where
I
he
knew
must
the
have
source.
plotted all his betrayals.
Daniel was reaching into
I
his
opened
network,
drawers,
leveraging
rifled through
every
folders,
contact,
and my
every
breath
favor,
caught when I found
every
a slim
smear
black
tactic he had
notebook
left.
hidden beneath stacks
He
of
wanted me to
financial
break,
journals.
to crawl
Inside
back into
were
the
scribbled
shell he had
notes,
kept me in for
dates,
years.
account
Instead,
numbers,
I
phone
sat
call
up straighter,
reminders,
thumb
his
hovering over the
handwriting,
phone before
his
shutting it
shorthand,
down.
his
If he
secrets.
thought fear would stop
One
me,
entry froze
he had
me,
forgotten who
came
he
in
made me
transfer.
become.
Use M
That
signature
afternoon,
if questioned.
Shannon arrived at my house
My blood
carrying
ran
2
cold.
bags of takeout
It
and
was
her usual
undeniable
fiery
proof he had
determination.
forged me into
we
his
sat at the
schemes.
kitchen table.
My hands
the smell
shook
of
as I
fried
snapped
chicken and
photos
biscuits
of
filling
every
the air.
page.
For
He's
the first
pushing
time,
harder.
I
I
wasn't
muttered,
just his wife
scrolling through
uncovering
another
betrayal.
wave of messages.
I was his executioner.
He won't stop
piecing
until I
together
break.
his downfall.
Shannon slammed
the next
her fork
morning
onto the table.
Shannon helped me
Let
weave these
him.
details into
Every
the fake
dirty trick
confession.
he pulls just
Dates
proves
from
how
his
desperate
notebook,
he is.
language he often
And
used in
desperate men
emails,
make mistakes.
the kind of phrasing
I
that would
wanted to
sound
believe her,
distinctly like him.
but the weight pressed
it was
heavy on my
terrifying how
chest.
quickly the puzzle
Daniel
fit
knew
together.
my weak spots.
How easily I could
He had
slip
lived
into his
beside them
voice.
for years.
But it was also
He knew
empowering.
about my estranged brother,
Every sentence
about my
I
old
wrote
debts,
was like driving
about
another
the
nail into the
insecurities I
coffin of
still
the married
carried
like
like
stolen my
scars.
future.
If he chose
By
to
the
use
end of the
those,
day, the trial could
document
turn
was
ugly
airtight.
fast. Shannon leaned back in her
Closer,
chair,
her voice
exhaling.
firm. He's
This
banking
isn't
on you
just a
folding.
weapon, Marissa.
Don't give him
This
the
is nuclear.
satisfaction.
I
Later
stared
that
at the
evening,
pages glowing on
a
the
knock
screen.
rattled my front
A strange
door.
calm
My
settling
pulse
over me.
spiked. And for
I
a brief
didn't just
second,
want
I
Daniel
froze.
ruined.
Half
I
expecting
wanted
to
him
see Daniel
exposed,
standing there with
stripped
that
bare
smug
for the
grin
world to
plastered
see.
across his
No
face.
mask,
But
no
when
charm.
I opened it,
Just the
a
monster
man
he
in a
really
dark
was.
suit stood on the
2
porch.
days later, he
Daniel
introduced
showed
himself
up
as a
again,
private
pounding
investigator.
on my door.
Hired
His
by
hair
Daniel's
was
team.
unkempt.
His
His
questions
questions
were
were
slick,
desperation
practiced,
carved into his
designed to
face.
slip past my
Marissa,
Alexa, open the door.
Mrs. Caldwell.
His voice
Do you
cracked.
have any history of
I waited a
financial
full minute
mismanagement
before
yourself?
unlocking it. Have you
Just
ever
long enough
struggled
to
with
remind
debt
him
that
who
could
held the
suggest
power
your
now?
motivations aren't
When
pure?
I finally opened it,
I
his
crossed
eyes
my
darted
arms,
past me,
refusing to
searching.
answer.
The
You can tell
papers.
Daniel this.
Have you signed
The more
them?
he digs,
His voice
the more
was
dirt
frantic,
he's going to bury
his hands
himself
shaking.
under. I forced
The
myself to
investigator's
stay
smile
calm,
faltered
to
for just
tilt
a
my
moment
head in
before he
feigned
slipped a
confusion.
business card into my
I'm
hand.
still looking them over.
I didn't need
I
it.
said coolly.
His presence
alone
face
told me
darkened.
Daniel was running
There's
out of
no
ammunition.
time. Do you
That
understand
night,
what's at
sleep
stake?
evaded me. I
let
tossed
silence
beneath the
stretch,
blankets, then
haunted
smiled
by the
faintly.
thought of Daniel lurking in the shadows
I
of my
think I
life.
understand better than
It
you
wasn't
think.
paranoia.
For a flicker
It
of a
was
moment,
history.
suspicion
I
crossed his
remembered the
face,
nights he came
but he
home
shoved
late,
it down,
the
too
lies
consumed
slipping
by
effortlessly
effortlessly
from his lips.
closing.
I remember
After
the way
left,
he controlled the
I put the
smallest
next part
details
of my
my
plan
world.
into motion.
What bills
I
were
created
paid,
anonymous
what clothes
email
I wore,
accounts,
what dreams
drafted
I cover
chase.
letters,
And now, though he no longer
confession
shared my house,
alongside
I felt
supporting
him invading
documents.
again.
The first
This time through
recipients,
intimidation instead of
investigative
manipulation.
journalists known for
But I
tearing
wasn't the
apart
same
corporate
woman I had
scandals.
been. The second,
I reached for my journal,
key board
the one I
members
had
of
started the
Daniel's
day
firm.
after I filed for
And the
divorce,
third,
and
the most
scribbled words
deliciously
like
strategic,
He
were
cannot
rival
touch
companies
me.
who would leap at
He
the
cannot
chance to
break
dismantle
me.
him. His power
Each
is
email
slipping,
was carefully
and I will
timed,
not bend.
sent in intervals,
The pen steadied
like
my
ticking
hand,
bombs placed
and at
across
last,
the battlefield.
I slept. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as I prepared myself for
I
this
met with
war,
my lawyer to
a small
discuss
part
Daniel's
of me hesitated.
tactics.
What
His
if
office was
Clarissa was
cluttered with
only
stacks
telling
of
half the
files,
story?
case law,
What if
and
she was
coffee cups,
protecting herself
but his
while
mind
handing
was
me
sharp,
just enough to burn
focused.
Daniel? He's trying to rattle
to
you,
the fear
he
in
said
her eyes.
bluntly. The
It's
urgency in her
intimidation.
voice, plain and
No,
simple.
she wasn't lying.
But it's also a sign
She was
of
terrified
weakness.
because she knew how
He
ruthless
slid a new
Daniel could
folder
be.
across the desk
And if he
toward me.
realized she had
This
spoken
came
to
in
me,
late last
she
night.
would be in as much
Records
danger as
from
I
his
was.
most recent
That
employer.
realization lit
I
a
opened
fire
the folder
inside
and
me.
scanned the pages.
This wasn't just
My
about
eyes
revenge
widening.
anymore.
There it was
about
proof
survival.
that Daniel hadn't
For
just
me,
stolen
for
from
Clarissa,
me,
but
and
had
for
been
anyone
skimming
else who
funds
had
from
been
his job
entangled
as
in
well.
Daniel's web of lies.
Why would he risk that?
That night, I lay
whispered.
awake in bed, my lawyer
staring
leaned
at the
back
ceiling,
in his chair,
plotting my next
because
move.
men like him
I
always
couldn't
think
simply
they're
hand the
smarter than
evidence
system,
over
and hope the system would
He didn't
protect
expect
me.
you to fight
Daniel
back.
was too
And now
clever,
he's sloppy,
too manipulative.
My chest swelled
He'd
with a
twist
mix
the
of
narrative,
rage and relief.
paint me as the
The net
unstable
was
wife,
closing around
the
him.
bitter woman lashing
By
out
Sunday
after being
afternoon,
left. The tension
No,
finally
I had to
broke
control
into
the story.
confrontation.
I had
As
to
I left the
expose him in a
grocery
way
store,
that left
bags
no
in
room
hand,
for his lies.
I spotted
And I
Daniel
knew
leaning
just how to
against
do
his
it.
car across the lot.
My plan would not
He
just
wasn't
destroy
supposed
his
to approach
career.
me outside of
It would
court,
strip him of his
but rules
reputation,
had never stopped
his
him
allies,
before, and his carefully
He strode
crafted
toward
mask
me,
of respectability.
his smile sharp
By the
enough
time
to
I
cut
was
glass.
finished, Daniel
You think
would be
you're
a man
winning,
the
don't
world
you?
turned its back
He
on.
hissed,
Begging
keeping
for
his
mercy
voice
he
low
would
enough
never
for
receive.
others not to notice.
As the clock ticked
But you
past
don't
midnight,
know what I have.
I opened my
You
laptop
don't know
and
what
began
I'm
writing.
capable of.
Not
My
letters,
hands tightened around the
not
grocery
petitions.
bags.
My
A
confession.
pounding.
Only
For
it
years,
wasn't
I would
mine.
have shrunk under that
It was
look, that
Daniel's.
threat.
But
Using
not
the
anymore.
documents Clarissa had
I
given me
stepped
as a
closer,
guide,
meeting
I
his
drafted a
eyes
detailed
head-on.
account of his
I know
schemes,
exactly what
written
you're
as though it came
capable of,
directly
Daniel.
from him.
Lies,
The fake confession
theft,
outlined every
cowardice.
forged signature,
That's all
every
you've
stolen
ever
dollar,
had.
every
His face
deception.
hardened.
It was
The mask
damning,
cracking just
airtight.
enough to reveal the
By the
fury
time I
beneath.
finished, my
He
fingers
leaned
ached,
closer, but my
so
heart
close I
raced
could
with
smell the bitter
anticipation.
tang of whiskey on
This
his breath.
wasn't just evidence
If you don't
anymore.
stop this was
I'll
a weapon,
ruin you,
sharp
I'll
and ready
drag
to
your
be
name through
unleashed.
the mud until
And
no
when
one
the time
believes
was
you.
right,
My
Daniel
heart
wouldn't
hammered,
know what hit him.
but I didn't flinch.
But as I saved the file and shut the
ruined
laptop,
me once.
I caught my
I said
reflection in the
quietly.
darkened screen.
And I survived.
My own eyes stared
That's the
back
difference
at me,
between us.
fierce and
You
unflinching.
can't survive without
For
control.
years,
I had
and
been
you've
the
already
quiet,
lost
dutiful
it.
wife.
For a moment,
bending under the
his
weight
jaw
of Daniel's
clenched,
lies.
and I thought he might
Now,
strike
I
me
was
right
something
there in
else
the parking
entirely.
lot.
But
A
then
woman
he stepped
reborn in
back,
fire and
muttering
betrayal.
something under his
A woman
breath
who
as he
wasn't
turned
just
and
fighting
stormed
back.
away.
She
I
was
stood
rewriting
frozen,
the story.
the weight of adrenaline
And as much
flooding
as
my
Daniel
body
had hurt me,
but inside
as much
me
as he
burned
had
something
stolen
stronger
from me,
than fear.
he had given me this one gift
He was
without
unraveling
realizing
it, and for
the
once,
strength to become
I wasn't
his
the
greatest
one trembling.
The
When I
morning
got
after
home,
drafting the confession,
Shannon was waiting.
I woke up with a pounding
I told
heart,
her everything,
the kind that
every
comes
word
not from
Daniel
fear
had
but
spat
from
at me.
anticipation.
And instead of panic,
the sun cut
her
across my
face lit
blinds
with
in sharp
determination.
stripes.
And for the
That's
first
it,
time
she
in
said.
months, I
He's
felt clarity.
cracking.
My
My
plan
plan
wasn't
wasn't
just
just
an
an
idea.
idea.
So he
It was a
lashing
storm
out,
waiting to break.
That's when people
I
make
sat
their
at my
biggest
kitchen table,
mistakes. Sipping black coffee.
She was right.
Staring at the
The
manila
courtroom
folder
was where the
Daniel
war
had
would
left
be
for me.
decided.
Inside
Not in
were the
parking
documents
lots or
or
anonymous
anonymous
messages.
messages. The very
And
news
Daniel
he
had
thought he
already
could slip
shown the
around
jury
my neck
one
without
side of
me
himself.
noticing.
The
I
polished
almost
liar.
laughed at the arrogance.
It was only a matter of
But
time
instead
before
of
they saw the
signing,
man
I
I had
began
just
making
seen.
copies.
The man who couldn't
Scanning
stand
every
to lose.
page.
Saving
As I sat
each
on the
file to
couch,
encrypted
clutching my
drives.
journal,
Then
I
I
whispered
slipped
to
them back
myself,
into the folder
"He's
as if
almost
untouched.
Almost.
Daniel would believe I
And
was
for the
still
first
wavering.
time,
I didn't just
he would
believe
never
it.
see the knife I was
could
holding
feel it in
behind
my
my
bones.
back.
The
But
first
deep down,
person I shared my
also knew
draft
this.
with was Shannon.
Men like
I
Daniel
brought her to
never
my
went
kitchen,
down quietly.
locked the doors,
He would have
and
one
slid
last
the
card
laptop
to play.
across to her.
One last
She read
desperate move
silently
before the end.
her eyes
and I
scanning
would need
every
to be
word.
ready for it.
With each sentence,
because the final final act of this battle wasn't just about winning, and finally, it was about making sure he never had the power to hurt me, this or anyone else, her voice low but firm. Monday morning, the courthouse loomed over me like a fortress. I leaned forward, both oppressive and strangely comforting. The air was crisp, people will believe it. The kind of fall morning where breath fogs in the air and nerves feel sharper. They won't just believe it. As I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, they'll devour it. I reminded myself of every night I had survived in silence. It needs supporting Daniel had forced from me. Things only Daniel would know. He had tried to bury. Details that make it undeniable. This was not just another day in court. My stomach dropped. It was the battlefield because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life. The jury filed in, thought I could never reach. Carefully neutral. That night, though I caught a few glances into Daniel's abandoned study. Daniel sat at his table, calm as a statue. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. His tie perfectly knotted. His hair immaculately styled, the one I used to love. That calm was a mask. His leather chair sat like a throne before the desk. His jaw
place where
clenched
he
just
must
a
have
little too
plotted all his
tightly.
betrayals.
He was planning
I opened
something.
drawers,
Rifled
and whatever
through
it
folders,
was, and my
I had
breath
to be
caught
ready.
when I found a slim
The trial
black
began
notebook
with
hidden
routine
beneath
motions.
stacks of financial
My lawyer
journals.
objecting to Daniel's
Inside
attempts
were
to
scribbled
suppress
notes,
evidence. The
dates,
judge ruling with a
account
steady
numbers,
gavel. Phone call
It was
reminders.
the rhythm of litigation,
His handwriting,
a dance of
his
words and
shorthand,
strategies,
his secrets.
But then,
Daniel's
one
attorney
entry
froze me,
rose,
carrying a thick
transfer,
binder in his
use M's
hands.
signature if
He
questioned.
moved toward the bench with an
My
almost
blood ran
triumphant
cold.
swagger. It was
Your
undeniable
Honor, he said
proof he had
smoothly,
forged me into
we have
his
new
schemes.
evidence that we believe
My
directly
hands shook as I
impacts the
snapped
credibility
photos
of
of
every
Mrs. Caldwell.
page.
For the first
My
time,
chest tightened.
I wasn't just his
New
wife
evidence?
uncovering betrayal.
My lawyer shot
I
me
was
a
his
quick glance,
executioner,
his brows
piecing
furrowing.
together his downfall.
The judge allowed it.
The next
and the
morning,
binder was
Shannon
presented.
helped me weave these
The screen
details
at the
into
front
the
of the
fake
courtroom
confession.
flickered to life.
Dates from his
Displaying
notebook,
documents,
language he often
bank
used in
statements,
emails,
transfers,
the kind of
and
phrasing that
receipts.
would sound
My
distinctly
name
like
was
him.
plastered across
It was
them,
terrifying
linked
how
to
quickly
offshore
the puzzle
accounts
fit
and
together.
suspicious withdrawals.
How easily I could slip into his
Gasps rippled
voice
through the room.
But it was also
I froze.
empowering.
My breath caught
Every
in my
sentence
throat.
I wrote was like
This was his
driving
last
another
card,
nail into the coffin
and
of
it
the
was
man who had
devastating.
stolen my future.
My lawyer jumped
By
to
the
his
end
feet,
of the day,
objecting
the document was
immediately.
airtight.
Your Honor,
Shannon leaned
these
back in her
documents
chair,
are fabricated.
exhaling.
We were not
This
given
isn't just a
discovery on these
weapon, Marissa.
materials.
This
They
is
must be
nuclear.
excluded until
I stared
properly
at the pages
verified.
glowing on the screen.
The judge agreed to examine them, but allowed the jury to view
I didn't
the
just
images.
want Daniel ruined.
It was a blow.
I wanted
One
him
designed to
exposed,
shake their confidence
stripped bare
in me.
for the world to see.
Daniel sat
no
back,
mask, no
smirking,
charm, as
just
if he
the
had
monster
just
he
won the
really
war.
was.
My
2
blood
days
boiled.
later,
But
Daniel
beneath the
showed up
fury was
again,
something else.
pounding on my
A
door.
sharp edge of fear.
His hair was unkempt.
Could the jury tell
His
these
tie
documents
missing.
were lies?
Desperation
Or would
carved
they
into
look
his
at me,
face.
the betrayed wife,
Marissa,
and
open
see
the
someone
door.
complicit?
His voice
Someone
cracked.
trying to smear her husband
I waited
for money?
a full minute before
Shannon's
unlocking
words
it,
echoed in my
just
head.
long enough to remind him
Desperate
who
men
held the
make
power
mistakes.
now.
When
Was
I
this
finally
his
opened
mistake?
it, or
His
mine
eyes
for
darted
underestimating
past me,
how far he
searching.
would go.
The papers.
When the court adjourned for
Have
recess,
you signed them?
I slipped
His
into the
voice
hallway.
was frantic,
my pulse
his hands
thundering in my
shaking.
ears.
I forced
The
myself to
fluorescent
stay
lights
calm,
hummed overhead,
to tilt my
harsh
head and
and
feign
unkind.
confusion. Shannon
I'm
found
still
me near
looking
the
them
water
over.
fountain. I said
Her
coolly,
face pale, but her
his
voice
face
fierce.
darkened. Don't let
There's
him
no
see you
time.
break. Do you
That's what he
understand
wants.
what's at stake? He's cornered.
I let silence
Marissa,
stretch.
This is all
then
he's got
smiled
left.
faintly.
Lies
Oh,
dressed as truth.
I think I understand better
My
than
lawyer
you think.
joined us. For a flicker
Flipping
of a
through
moment,
his phone
suspicion
furiously.
crossed his face.
We'll need a
but he shoved
forensic
it down.
accountant.
Too consumed
These
by panic
documents
to see
reek
the
of
trap
manipulation.
closing.
After
the
he
timing
left,
alone
I
proves
put
their
the next
bogus.
part of my plan
He
into
waited
motion.
until the last
I
moment
created
because he
anonymous
knows they
email
won't hold
accounts,
up under scrutiny.
drafted cover letters,
But the jury
and
doesn't
attached
know
the
that yet.
confession
His
alongside
words
supporting
gave me
documents.
little comfort. The first
I imagined the
recipients,
jurors,
investigative
whispering among
journalists
themselves,
known for tearing
doubt
apart
seeping in
corporate
like
scandals.
poison.
The
My
second
fight was no longer just about
board members
exposing
of Daniel's
Daniel's
firm.
theft.
It
And
was
the
about
third,
protecting
the
my
most
own name
deliciously
from the shadow
strategic,
he had cast.
were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But
When
as I
court
prepared
resumed,
myself for this
Daniel's
war,
attorney
a
hammered
small
the
part
narrative
of me
of greed.
hesitated.
He painted
What if
me as a
Clarissa
woman
was only
scorned,
telling half the
seeking
story?
revenge through false
What if she was
accusations,
protecting herself
hiding her
while
own
handing me
financial
just enough to
misdeeds?
burn Daniel?
His words were
I
slick,
thought back to the fear in
convincing,
her eyes,
and for a moment,
the urgency
even
in
I
her
could
voice.
see how the jury might
No,
believe
she
them.
wasn't lying.
Daniel sat there
She
with
was
an air of
terrified
wounded
because she knew
dignity,
how ruthless
nodding
Daniel could
solemnly
be,
as if he were the
and if
victim
he
all
realized
along.
she had spoken to
Rage
me,
simmered in my
she
chest.
would be in as much danger
How many
as I
years
was.
had I watched him
That
lie so
realization lit a
effortlessly,
fire inside
turning
me.
his sins into my
This wasn't
burdens.
just about revenge
How many
anymore.
times had I been
It was
gaslit
about
into
survival.
questioning my own
For me,
reality?
for Clarissa,
This wasn't
and for
just a
anyone
trial.
else who had been
It was a
tangled in
replay of
Daniel's
my
web
marriage,
of lies.
a twisted theater
That
where
night,
Daniel
I lay
always
awake in
rewrote the
bed,
script,
staring at
But
the
now,
ceiling,
I
plotting
wasn't
my
the
next
silent
move.
partner anymore.
I couldn't simply
I
hand the
clenched my
evidence
fists,
over and hope the
whispering
system
about to
would protect
myself.
me.
I will
Daniel
not
was
let
too
him
clever,
rewrite me again.
too manipulative.
Finally,
It
he'd
was my
twist the
turn to
narrative,
take the stand.
paint me as the
bailiff
unstable
swore
wife,
me in,
the bitter
and I
woman
sat
lashing
under the
out
harsh
after being
glare of
left.
the courtroom lights.
No, I had to
Daniel's
control the
attorney
story.
wasted no time.
I had to expose him
Mrs.
in a way that
Caldwell,
left no room
are you
for his
denying
lies?
these financial
And I
records
knew
bear
just
your
how to
name?
do it.
His
My
voice
plan
dripped
would not
with
just
mockery.
destroy his career.
I lifted my
It
chin.
would strip him of his reputation.
I am denying they are
his
authentic.
allies,
And his
I have
carefully
never had
crafted
offshore
mask of
accounts,
respectability.
nor have I siphoned
By the
money
time
from
I
my
was
family.
finished, Daniel would be
He
a man the
leaned
world
closer,
turned its back on,
waving a paper,
begging for mercy
then
he would
how do
never
you
receive.
explain these signatures?
As the clock ticked past midnight,
My eyes locked on the
I opened
page.
my laptop and
Shaky,
began writing.
mismatched scribbles
Not
that looked like
letters,
mine but weren't.
Not petitions.
My heart pounded.
A confession.
That's not my
Only
handwriting.
It wasn't mine.
I said firmly.
It was Daniel's.
The attorney scoffed.
Using the documents Clarissa had given me as a guide.
But even as my pulse
I drafted
raced,
a detailed
I
account
caught
of his
something.
schemes.
An error
written
in
as
the
though
dates.
it came directly from
One
him.
transfer was
The fake
supposedly
confession
made on a
outlined
day
I
every
had been in the
forged
hospital
signature
after a surgery.
Every stolen dollar,
My breath
every
steadied.
deception.
This
It
was his
damning,
mistake.
airtight.
And I would use
By
it.
the time I finished,
my lawyer rose
fingers
for redirect. But my
His
heart
voice calm
raced
but
with
powerful.
anticipation.
Mrs.
This
Caldwell,
wasn't just
where
evidence
were you on
anymore.
March 18th?
This was a
the
weapon,
date this transfer
sharp and
supposedly
ready to be
occurred?
unleashed. And
My
when the
voice
time was
did not
right,
waver.
Daniel
I
wouldn't
was
know what hit
recovering
him.
from gallbladder
But as I
surgery.
saved the file and
At
shut
St.
the laptop,
Mary's Hospital.
I caught my reflection
You'll
in the
find my
darkened
medical
screen.
records confirm
My
it.
own eyes stared
Murmurs
back at me,
swept through the courtroom.
fierce and unflinching.
The attorney's smirk
For
faltered.
years, I
His
had been the
fingers
quiet,
tightening on the
dutiful
papers.
wife. For the
Bending
first
under the
time,
weight
the
of
balance
Daniel's
shifted.
lies.
My
Now,
lawyer
I
continued.
was something else entirely.
So, these documents
A woman
claim you
reborn
moved
in
thousands
fire
of dollars
and
from an
betrayal.
account in the Cayman
A woman
Islands
who
on the
wasn't
very
just
same day
fighting
you were
back.
bedridden and under
She was
post-op
rewriting
care.
the story. The
And
jury's
as much
eyes
as Daniel had
sharpened.
hurt me,
Suspicion
as much as he had
redirected.
stolen from me,
Daniel shifted
he had given
uncomfortably.
me this one gift
his
without
mask
realizing
cracking.
it. The
It was a
strength
small
to become
victory,
his greatest downfall.
but it was enough.
The morning after
I
drafting
felt
the
strength
confession,
surge through me
I
again.
woke up with a pounding heart.
He had tried
the
to bury
kind
me
that comes
under
not from
lies,
fear but
but
from
in his haste,
anticipation.
He
The
had
sun
left
cut
cracks
across
for the
my
truth to
blinds
shine
in sharp
through.
stripes.
The day
And for the
closed with
first
the
time in
judge
months,
ordering an
I felt
investigation
clarity.
into the
My
authenticity
plan
of the
wasn't just an
documents.
idea.
The jury
It
was
was a
instructed
storm
to
waiting to
withhold
break.
judgment until
I
verification.
sat at my kitchen table,
Relief
sipping
washed
black
over
coffee,
me, but it was
staring at the
laced
manila
with
folder
exhaustion.
Daniel had left
As
for
I
me.
walked out of the courthouse,
Inside were the documents
the
he
autumn
wanted
air
me to
felt
sign.
cooler, cleaner.
The very news he thought
Daniel
he could
lingered
slip
near
around
the
my
steps,
neck without me
his
noticing.
smile gone.
I
his
almost
eyes
laughed
cold
at the
and
arrogance.
arrogance.
But
This
instead of
isn't over.
signing,
I began
he hissed
making
as I
copies.
passed.
Scanning
stopped,
every page,
turned,
saving
and met
each
his
file
gaze
to
with
encrypted
every ounce of
drives.
steel I had left.
Then I slipped them
You're
back into the
right,
folder
I
as if
said.
untouched.
It's not.
Daniel would
But it
believe
will
I
be
was still
soon.
wavering.
And you
He
won't
would
like
never
the
see the
ending.
knife I was
For
holding
once,
behind my back.
he had no retort.
The first person I
His
shared my
silence was
draft
louder
with was
than any
Shannon.
threat.
I brought
I
her to my
climbed into
kitchen,
my car,
locked the
gripping the
doors,
steering
and
wheel,
slid the
and
laptop
whispered to
across to
myself.
her. Almost
She read
finished.
silently,
Almost.
her eyes scanning
Yet as I
every
drove
word.
home,
With
headlights
each
blurring
sentence,
past on the
her
highway,
lips tightened,
I couldn't
her jaw
shake the
set.
feeling that
And
Daniel had
finally,
one more trick
she
hidden.
closed the laptop
One
with
more
a snap.
desperate ploy to claw
This,
his way
she
out of
said,
the corner.
her voice low
the
but
forged
firm,
documents
is
had rattled
brilliant.
me. Yes,
It's risky,
but they had
it's
also
brilliant.
revealed his fear.
I leaned forward.
He was slipping.
Do you think
And
it will
desperate
hold?
men, as Shannon
Do you
had
think
said,
people will
made
believe it?
mistakes. She
I just
shook
had
her
to
head.
hold my ground a little
Marissa,
longer.
they
Fight a
won't
little
just
harder
believe it
and wait for the
They'll
final
devour
unraveling.
it.
But
The
we
morning
can't
of the
release
11th
it as
day of
is.
the trial began
It
with an
needs
unsettling
supporting
evidence
silence
that clung
things
to me
only
like
Daniel
a
would
second
know.
skin.
I
Details
woke
that make it
before dawn,
undeniable.
my heart restless,
My stomach
as if
dropped,
warning me that
because
today
that
would
meant
tilt
I'd
the
have to dig
scales in
deeper
one
into his
direction
life
or another.
Into the shadows he
kitchen
thought I
clock
could
ticked
never
loudly
reach.
as I sipped coffee
that
that
night,
tasted of ash
I
and
crept
nerves.
into Daniel's abandoned
Outside,
study.
the sun was
It was
only
the first
beginning to
time I'd
pierce
been
the
in there
horizon
since he left,
painting the sky
the
with
air was
streaks
stale,
of orange and
smelling
violet.
faintly of his
Shannon
cologne,
sat across
the
from
one I
me,
used to love.
scrolling through her phone.
His leather chair
Her face
sat like a
etched
throne
with worry.
before the desk.
You've got
the
this,
place where he must
she
have
said,
plotted all his
though her
betrayals.
voice carried more
I opened
determination than
drawers,
certainty.
rifled through folders,
I forced a
and
smile,
my breath
but
caught
deep
when I found a
inside,
slim black
I felt
notebook
the
hidden
unease
beneath
tightening
stacks
at
of
the front.
financial journals.
Today wasn't just
Inside
another
were
day in
scribbled
court.
notes. Daniel
Dates,
had been cornered,
account numbers,
and when men like
phone
him
call
sensed the walls
reminders.
closing in,
His
they
handwriting,
didn't go quietly.
his shorthand,
They lashed out
his
with venom
secrets.
and claws.
One entry
By the
froze
time
me.
we arrived at the
Cayman
courthouse,
transfer.
the air
Use
inside buzzed
signature
with tension.
questioned.
A storm waiting
My
to break.
blood ran cold.
The judge took a
It was
seat.
undeniable
The jury
proof
filed
he had
in,
forged
and
me into
Daniel
his
appeared with his
schemes.
attorney trailing
My
behind
hands
him.
shook as I snapped
both wearing
photos of
smug
every
expressions
page.
that chilled me.
For the first time,
something had shifted
I wasn't
overnight.
just his wife
I could
uncovering
see it
betrayal.
in Daniel's eyes.
I was his
Too
executioner,
sharp, too calculating.
piecing together his downfall.
My lawyer leaned toward
the
me,
next
whispering,
morning.
Shannon
"Be
helped me
prepared.
weave these details
He's
into the
going
fake
to
confession.
escalate."
Dates
As if
from his
on cue,
notebook, language
Daniel's
he often
attorney
used
stood
in
and
emails,
announced they had
the
secured
kind
a
of phrasing that
surprise
would sound
witness.
distinctly like him. The courtroom
It was
gasped.
terrifying how quickly
I
the puzzle
felt my
fit
stomach
together.
drop like a
How
stone into
easily I
dark
could
water.
slip into his voice.
Who could he possibly
But it was
bring in
also
now?
empowering.
The doors
Every
opened,
sentence I
and in
wrote
walked
was
a
like
woman with
driving
perfectly
another nail
styled
into
hair.
the coffin of the
A
man who
designer
had
coat
stolen my
draped over her
future.
shoulders. By the
And
end of
eyes
the
that
day,
gleamed with malice
the
the
document
moment
was
they landed on
airtight.
me.
My
Shannon
blood
leaned
ran
back in her
cold.
chair.
It was Victoria
exhaling.
Hayes.
This
Daniel's
isn't just a
longtime
weapon,
mistress.
Marissa.
The woman
This
he
is
swore was
nuclear.
just a friend.
I stared at the pages glowing
she
on on the stand, a smile calm settling over me.
I didn't
known
just
Daniel
want Daniel
for years,
ruined,
she began.
I wanted him exposed,
her voice dripping with
stripped
faux
bare for the world to
sincerity.
see, and I
No
can
mask,
tell you,
no charm.
he is a man
just
of
the
integrity.
monster he really was.
If anyone's
2
lying
days
here,
later,
it's
Daniel
Marissa.
showed up again,
My chest
pounding
tightened,
on my door,
rage boiling
his hair
beneath
was
my
unkempt,
ribs.
his tie
Daniel
missing,
sat back in his chair,
desperation
smug
carved into his
satisfaction
face,
spreading across his face
Marissa,
as Victoria
open the
spun her
door.
tail.
His voice
Painting me as a
cracked.
bitter wife
I
clinging
waited
to
a
false
full minute
accusations
before
out of
unlocking
spite.
it.
Just
long
long
enough
enough
to remind
Daniel
him who
had
held the
always
power
been
now.
transparent about
When
finances.
I finally opened it,
while I had been
his eyes
controlling,
darted past
manipulative,
me,
searching,
and obsessed with
the
appearances.
papers.
Have
Each
you
word was a
signed them?
dagger.
His
and I could
voice
see
was
some
frantic,
jurors shifting
his hands
uncomfortably,
shaking.
uncertain
I forced
whom to
myself
believe.
to stay calm,
My hands
to
gripped
tilt
the
my
table,
head in feigned
knuckles
confusion,
white.
as I
I'm
fought
still
to keep
looking
my
them
composure.
over.
I
If
said
I lashed
coolly.
out,
His
I'd
face
only
darkened.
confirm the story she was
There's
weaving.
no time.
When
Do you
cross-examination
understand
began,
what's at stake?
my lawyer pounced
I
like a
let
wolf on
silence
prey.
stretch, He
then
asked
smiled
Victoria
faintly.
how long she had been close
I
to
think
Daniel.
I understand better
She
than
hesitated,
you think.
then
For a
claimed
flicker
it
of a
had only
moment,
been a few
suspicion
months.
crossed his face.
That was her
But he
first
shoved
mistake.
it down.
My
Too
lawyer
consumed by
presented
panic
hotel
to see the
receipts,
trap closing.
credit card
After
statements,
he left,
and
I
photos
put the
showing
next
years
part
of
of my
connection
plan
and
between them.
promotion. The
I
courtroom
created
gasped
anonymous
again,
email
and I
accounts,
caught the flicker of
drafted
panic
cover
in her
letters,
eyes,
and attached the
so,
confession
my lawyer pressed,
alongside
"You've
supporting
been lying about
documents.
the length of your
The first
involvement.
recipients.
Why should this jury
Investigative
believe
journalists
anything else
known
you're
for
saying?"
tearing apart corporate
Victoria's
scandals.
facade cracked.
The second,
her voice trembling as she
keyboard
tried to
members of
redirect
Daniel's firm.
but the damage was
And the
done.
third,
the
the
most
jury leaned
deliciously
forward
strategic,
now,
suspicion heavy in
companies
the
who
air.
would leap at the chance
I
to
almost
dismantle
pitted
him.
her. Each email was carefully timed.
She had chosen to tie
sent in
herself to
intervals,
Daniel's sinking
like
ship,
ticking bombs
and
placed
now she would
across
go
the
down with him.
battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as I
Daniel
prepared
wasn't
myself for
finished.
this war, during a
small
recess,
part of me
he cornered
hesitated.
me near the restroom.
What if Clarissa
His
was
face
only
twisted in
telling
rage
half the
beneath the
story?
mask he wore for the
What
jury?
if she was protecting
You think
herself
you're
while
winning?
handing me just
He
enough
hissed,
to
his
burn
breath
Daniel?
hot and bitter. I thought
I'll
back to the
destroy
fear in
you
her
before I
eyes,
let you take
the
what's
urgency
mine.
in her voice.
His words slithered into my
she
ears,
wasn't lying.
dark and venomous.
She was terrified
But I stood my
because she
ground,
knew how ruthless
staring into
Daniel
the
could
eyes of
be.
the man I once
And if
thought
he
I
realized
loved.
she had spoken
You
to me,
already destroyed
she would be
yourself,
in as much danger
I
as
said
I
quietly.
was. His
That
lip
realization
curled
lit
into
a fire
inside me.
You'll regret
this
this.
wasn't just about
Then he
revenge
walked
anymore.
away,
Leaving
It was
me
about
trembling but
survival.
resolute.
For me, for
Shannon
Clarissa,
rushed to my
and
side,
for anyone else who had been
gripping my
tangled in
arm.
Daniel's web
Don't
of lies.
let him rattle you.
That night, I
He's
lay awake in
unraveling.
bed,
She
staring
was
at the
right.
ceiling,
His
plotting my
mask had
next
slipped,
move. And the cracks
I couldn't
were
simply
widening.
hand the evidence
All
over
I had
and
to do
hope the
was hold
system
steady
would
long
protect
enough
me.
for the truth to
Daniel
finish
was
what it
too
had
clever.
started.
Too
That
manipulative.
afternoon,
My lawyer
he'd
presented
twist the
witnesses
narrative,
of our own.
paint me as the
neighbors,
unstable wife,
colleagues, the
and
bitter
even
woman
family
lashing
friends
out
who
after being
testified
left.
about Daniel's controlling
No,
behavior.
I had to control
his
the
gambling
story.
habits.
I had
and
to
the sudden
expose him
luxuries
in a
he
way
had
that
flaunted
left
despite
no
our
room for
dwindling
his
retirement
lies.
funds.
And I knew
Piece
just
by
how to do
piece.
it. The narrative
My plan
shifted.
would not just destroy
Where
his
Daniel
career.
had tried to cast
It would
himself
strip
as the
him of his
victim.
reputation,
The reality
his
began to
allies,
shine through
and
like
his carefully
sunlight breaking
crafted mask of
clouds.
respectability.
Still, the jury
By the time
remained
I was
pensive,
finished,
weighing
Daniel
the
would
lies
be a man
against
the
the
world
truth,
turned its back
unsure
on,
of which was
begging
heavier.
for mercy he
As
would
I
never
sat there,
receive.
listening to
As the clock
testimonies
ticked
of people
past
who had seen the
midnight,
cracks in
I
Daniel's
opened my
facade long
laptop
before
and
I
began
admitted them
writing.
myself.
Not
A strange
letters,
mix of grief
not
and validation
petitions.
washed over me.
A confession.
They saw him now for
Only
what
it
he
wasn't
was.
mine.
But
It
would
was
it be
Daniel's.
enough? Or was
Using
his
the
lies,
documents Clarissa
sharpened
had
by
given me
years
as
of
a guide,
practice,
I
still
drafted a
tipped the
detailed
scales in
account
his
of his
favor?
schemes.
When the
Written
day's
as though
session
it came
ended,
directly
the
from him.
courthouse steps were
The
crowded
fake
with
confession
reporters,
outlined every
microphones
forged
thrust
signature,
forward, every
cameras
stolen dollar,
flashing like
every
relentless
deception.
lightning.
I
It was
shielded my
damning,
face,
airtight.
ignoring their questions.
By the
But
time
one
I
sentence
finished,
cut through
my
the
fingers
noise.
ached.
Mrs.
But my heart
Caldwell,
raced with
how do you
anticipation.
respond to accusations
This
that you're
wasn't just
fabricating the story
evidence
for
anymore.
financial gain?
This was a weapon.
My breath
sharp
caught.
and ready to be
That
unleashed.
was the seed Daniel had
And when the
planted.
time was right,
And it was sprouting
Daniel
fast
wouldn't
in the
know what
media.
hit him.
I forced
But as I
myself
saved
to
the
keep
file
walking,
and shut the
my
laptop,
heels clicking
I
against
caught
the
my
concrete.
reflection in the darkened
Each step a
screen.
declaration
My
that I would
own
not
eyes
break in
stared back
public.
at me.
But once
Fierce
I
and
reached the
unflinching.
safety of my car,
For years,
I let out
I
a
had
shaky
been the
breath.
quiet, dutiful wife,
Daniel wasn't just fighting in
bending
the
under the
courtroom
weight of
anymore.
Daniel's lies.
He was waging
Now,
war on
I was
every
something
front,
else entirely.
trying to bury me
A
under the
woman
weight of his
reborn in
lies.
fire and
And I
betrayal.
knew with chilling
A woman
certainty
who wasn't just fighting
that tomorrow
back.
would be even
She
worse.
was rewriting the
That
story.
night,
And
I
as much
couldn't
as
sleep.
Daniel had hurt me,
The house
as
felt
much as he
colder
had
than
stolen
usual.
from me,
The silence
he had
pressing
given
in
me
like
this
a
one
heavy
gift
blanket.
without realizing
I
it.
replayed
The
every
strength
moment
to
of the day in
become
my
his
head.
greatest downfall.
Victoria's
The
smirk,
morning after drafting
Daniel's
the
whispered
confession,
threats.
I woke
the
up
jurors
with a
shifting
pounding heart.
expressions. The kind
My
that comes
mind
not
was
from
a storm
fear
of
but from
wipes.
anticipation.
What if the jury
the sun
believed
cut
him?
across my blinds
What if
in
all
sharp
my fight
sight
had been for
And for
nothing?
the first time in months,
I wandered into the
I
living
felt
room,
clarity.
staring at the
My
family
plan
photos
wasn't
on the
just an
wall.
idea. Smiling
It was a
faces
storm from a
waiting
life
to
that
break.
felt like it belonged
I
to
sat at my
someone
kitchen
else.
table. I traced
Sipping
my
black
fingers
coffee,
over the frame of a
staring
picture
at the
from our
manila
early
folder
years.
Daniel had
When
left
love
for me.
had seemed real.
Inside were the
Before
documents he
deception
wanted
hollowed
me
it
to
out.
sign.
Tears
The very
blurred
news
my
he
vision,
thought he could slip
but I
around my
wiped
neck
them away.
without me noticing.
missing.
No more.
I almost
I
laughed
whispered.
at the arrogance.
I wasn't the woman
but
in those
instead of
photos
signing
anymore.
I began making
Tomorrow,
copies.
I would walk
scanning
back
every
into that
page,
courtroom ready to
saving
end
each
this
file
battle
to
once and for
encrypted
all.
drives.
As the
Then
clock
I
struck
slipped them back
midnight,
into the folder
I made
as if
myself
untouched.
a promise.
Daniel
I would not
believe
let
I was
Daniel
still
win.
wavering.
Not
He
because
would
of the
never
money,
see the knife
not
I was
because of
holding
pride,
behind my back,
but because of every
the first
sleepless
person I
night,
shared my
every
draft
tear
with
shed
was
in
Shannon.
secret,
I
every
brought
piece
her to
of
my
myself
kitchen,
I had lost to
locked
his
the
betrayal,
doors, and
this
slid the
fight
laptop
wasn't about
across to
revenge
her.
anymore.
She read
It was about
silently,
reclaiming my life,
her eyes scanning
my dignity,
every word,
and my future.
With each sentence,
And if Daniel
her lips
thought he could
tightened,
silence
her
me
jaw
with forged
set,
papers,
and finally,
mistresses,
she closed
or
the
whispered
laptop with a
threats.
snap.
He was gravely
"This,"
mistaken.
she said, her voice
Tomorrow,
low but firm,
the mask he
"is
clung to
brilliant.
would shatter completely.
It's risky, but
and
it's
when
brilliant.
it did, everyone
I
would
leaned
finally see
forward.
the man behind
Do
it.
you think it
the
will
coward
hold?
who had drained his
Do you
wife,
think
his
people
family,
will believe
and
it?
himself until there was
She
nothing
shook her
left but
head.
rot.
Marissa,
the final day
they
of the
won't
trial
just believe
arrived
it.
cloaked in a
They'll
suffocating
devour
stillness.
it. as though the universe itself was holding its breath. It needs supporting evidence. Before the mirror that morning, only Daniel would
staring
know,
at a face that
details
barely
that
resembled the woman who had walked into this courtroom.
My stomach
weeks ago.
dropped.
Because
My
that
eyes
meant
were
I'd have
sharper
to dig
now,
deeper into
my
his
posture
life.
straighter, into the shadows he thought I could never reach. The storms Daniel had unleashed. I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. I felt something ignite inside me. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. A resolve that had been forged in fire. The air was stale. Today wasn't just about justice in the one I used to love. Today was about closing the door on the nightmare that had stolen years of my life and ensuring Daniel never had the power to destroy me again. I opened drawers as I picked up my folders. I whispered to my reflection when I found a slim black notebook hidden beneath stacks of financial journals. Then I walked out. Inside were scribbled notes. War. Dates, the courtroom buzzed like a hive when we arrived. Call reminders. Reporters jostled at the entrance, his shorthand, their questions biting and insistent. But I moved through them with a calm steadiness that surprised even me. Use M's signature Shannon squeezed my hand before we entered the chamber. My blood ran cold. Her eyes gleaming with pride. It was undeniable proof he had forged me into his schemes. Daniel sat smugly at his table. My hands shook as I snapped photos of every page. For the first time, I wasn't just his wife uncovering betrayal. I was his executioner. We will now hear his down statements. The next morning, Shannon helped me weave these details into the fake confession. Weaving the narrative of betrayal, from his notebook, lies, language he often used in emails Daniel had inflicted. The kind of phrasing that would sound distinctly like him. He spoke of trust violated, how quickly the puzzle fit dismantled, how easily I could slip into his voice. The jury leaned in, empowering. Every word pulling them further I wrote was like driving another nail into the coffin of the man who had stolen my future. He thundered with false conviction. By the end of the day, portraying me as vindictive and greedy. Shannon leaned back in her argument were too wide now. The jurors shifted, just a weapon, Marissa. Unimpressed by the theatrics. This is nuclear. Daniel himself grew restless, glowing on the screen, whispering harshly to his attorney, calm settling over me. His mask slipping more with each desperate Daniel ruined. When the defense finally ended, the courtroom held a collective breath. No mask. Then the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. He really was. The hours that followed felt like years. Daniel showed up again. I sat rigid, pounding on my door. Taut. His hair was at my side, murmuring reassurances I barely heard. Desperation carved into his face like a caged animal. Marissa, his eyes darting toward me with venom. His voice cracked. At one point, I waited a full minute before unlocking it. Enjoy your victory, long enough to remind him who held the power now. When I finally opened it, his eyes no longer had teeth. Searching. He had already lost the papers. He just didn't know it yet. His voice was frantic. His air was so thick with tension, I felt like myself to stay calm, collapse, to tilt my head in feigned confusion. Holding the verdict slip with trembling hands, I said coolly, "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Marissa Caldwell. Do you understand what's at stake?" The words echoed like thunder. I let silence through every wall Daniel had tried to build around his lies. My breath I understand better tears than blurring you think. My vision as the judge read the details. Suspicion crossed his face. Restitution for the retirement funds, down. Spousal support, consumed by panic damages for fraud. Daniel's face twisted into something monstrous. Part of my plan into motion. Clenching white, I created an anonymous email account. He slammed his hand on the cover letters, shouting, and attached "This is confession" alongside supporting documents to restrain him. The first time, I saw investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The man who once towered over my life was now nothing more than a bitter shadow. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But as the officers escorted him for this war, he turned his head toward me, hesitated, his eyes wild. What if Clarissa was only telling half the story? He spat. What if she was protecting herself while handing me just enough to burn Daniel? I thought back to the fear in her eyes, his voice steady, the urgency in her voice. No, she wasn't lying. Relief washed over me. She was terrified because she knew how ruthless Daniel could be. After being underwater too long. And if he realized she had spoken to me, hugged me tightly. She would be in as much danger as I was. Daniel wasn't finished. That realization lit a fire inside me. He cornered me near the restroom. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. His face twisted in rage beneath the mask he wore for the jury. For me, for Clarissa, you're winning, and for anyone else who had been tangled in Daniel's web of lies. I'll destroy you before I let you take what's mine. I lay awake in bed, his words slithered into my ears, plotting my next move. But I couldn't simply hand the evidence over and hope the system would protect me. Daniel was already too clever, destroyed yourself, too manipulative, I said quietly. He'd twist the narrative, his lip curled into a sneer. Me as the unstable You'll wife. Regret this. The bitter woman lashing out after being left, leaving me trembling but resolute. I had to control the story. Shannon rushed to my side, expose him in a way that left no room for his lies. Don't let him rattle you. And I knew just how to do it. He's unraveling. My plan would not just destroy his career. His mask would strip him of his reputation, his allies. All I had to do was hold steady long enough for the truth to finish what it had started. By the time I was finished, that afternoon, Daniel would be a man the world turned its back on. begging for mercy he would never receive, and even family friends who testified about Daniel's controlling behavior. I opened my laptop, his gambling habits, ranting, and the sudden luxuries he had flaunted despite our dwindling retirement funds. A confession, piece by piece. Only it wasn't the narrative shifted. It was Daniel's. Where Daniel had tried to cast himself as the victim, Clarissa had given the reality began to shine through like sunlight breaking clouds. Still, the jury remained pensive. The fake confession outlined every forged signature, which was heavier, every stolen dollar, as I sat there, every deception. Listening to testimonies of people who had seen the cracks in Daniel's facade. By the time long before I admitted them myself, my fingers ached. A strange mix of grief and validation washed over me. This wasn't just evidence for what he was. This was a weapon. Would it be enough? Sharp and ready to be unleashed. And when the time was right, Daniel wouldn't know what hit in his favor. But as I saved the file and shut the laptop, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters in the darkened screen. Microphones thrust forward. My own eyes stared back at me, cameras flashing like fierce and unflinching. I shielded my face, ignoring their questions. I had been the quiet, dutiful wife, one sentence cut through the noise, bending under the weight of Daniel's lies. Mrs. Caldwell, how do you respond to accusations that you're fabricating this story for financial gain? Fire and betrayal. My breath caught. A woman who wasn't just fighting back. Daniel had planted. She was rewriting the story fast in the media. And as much as Daniel had hurt me, myself to as much as he had stolen from me, my heels clicking against the concrete. He had given me this one gift without declaration that I would not break in public. To become his greatest downfall. But once I reached the safety of my car, drafting the confession, I let out a shaky breath. I woke up with a pounding heart. Daniel wasn't just fighting in the courtroom anymore, but from anticipation. He was waging war on every front. The sun cut across my blinds and shone to the weight of his lies. And for the first time in months, I knew with chilling certainty that tomorrow wasn't just an idea. That night, it was a storm waiting to break. The house sat at my kitchen table, unusual, sipping black coffee, the silence pressing in like a heavy blanket. Folder Daniel had left for me. Every moment of the day in my head, the documents he wanted me to sign. Daniel's whispered threats, he could slip around my neck without me noticing. My mind was a storm at the arrogance. What if the jury believed him? I began making copies. Fight had been for nothing. Scanning every page. I wandered into the living room, file to staring at the family photos on the wall. Then I slipped them back into the folder as if a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Daniel would believe I was still wavering. I traced my fingers over the frame of a picture from I was holding behind my back. When love had seemed real, the first person I shared my draft with was Shannon. Tears blurred my vision, but I wiped them away and slid the laptop across to her. I whispered. She read silently. I wasn't the woman in those photos anymore. Scanning every word. Tomorrow, with each sentence, I would walk back into that courtroom ready to end this battle once and for all. And finally, she closed the laptop with a snap. I made myself a promise. Her voice low but firm. I would not let Daniel win. It's not because of the money, but it's brilliant. Not because of pride. I leaned forward. But because of every sleepless night. Do you think it will hold? Every tear shed in secret. Do you think people will believe it? Every piece of myself I had lost. She shook her head. This fight wasn't about revenge anymore. They won't just believe it. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. As is. And if Daniel thought he could silence me with forged papers, only Daniel would know. Mistresses, details that make it undeniable. He was gravely mistaken. My stomach dropped. Tomorrow, because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life. Into the shadows he thought I could never reach. Everyone would finally see the man behind it. I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. His family. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. The final day of the trial arrived, smelling faintly of his cologne, stillness, the one I used to love. As though the universe itself was holding its breath. Like a throne before the desk. I stood before the mirror that morning, the place where he must have staring at a face that barely resembled the woman who had walked into this courtroom weeks ago. And my eyes were sharp when I found a slim black notebook hidden beneath stacks of financial journals. Despite the storms Daniel had scribbled notes. As I buttoned my navy blazer, I felt something ignite inside me. His handwriting, a resolve that had been forged in fire. His secrets. Today wasn't just about justice in the legal sense. Came in transfer. Today was about closing the door on the nightmare that had stolen years of my life and ensuring Daniel never had the power to destroy me again. He had forged me into his schemes. As I picked up my bag, my hands shook as I snapped photos of every page. This is the last time he gets to stand in my way. For the first time, I wasn't just his wife uncovering betrayal. I was his executioner, like a hive when we arrived. Piecing together his downfall. Reporters jostled at the entrance. Morning, their questions helped me weave these details into the fake confession. Through them with a calm steadiness from his that surprised even me. Language he often used in emails. Squeezed my hand the kind of phrasing that would sound distinctly like him. Gleaming with pride. It was terrifying how quickly the puzzle fit together. Daniel sat smugly at his table. How easily I could slip into his voice. The twitch at the corner of his jaw. But it was also empowering. A telltale sign of a man unraveling. Every sentence I wrote was like driving another nail into the coffin of the man who had stolen my future. We will now hear by the end of the day. The document was airtight. My lawyer rose, Shannon leaned back in her chair, weaving the narrative of betrayal, this isn't just a calculated cruelty that Daniel had inflicted. He didn't just speak of money glowing on the screen. He spoke of trust violated, calm settling over me. Dismantled. I didn't just want Daniel ruined to him. I wanted him exposed. Every word pulling them further into the undeniable truth. No charm. When it was Daniel's attorney's turn, he thundered with false conviction. Daniel showed up again, as vindictive and on my door. But the cracks in their argument were too wide now. The jurors
Desperation
shifted,
carved into his
unimpressed
face.
by the theatrics.
"Marissa, open the
Daniel
door."
himself grew
His
restless,
voice cracked.
whispering harshly
I waited
to his
a full
attorney,
minute before
his
unlocking
mask
it,
slipping more
just
with
long
each
enough to
desperate
remind him who
argument.
held the power
When
now.
the defense finally
When I
ended,
finally opened
the
it,
courtroom
his
held a
eyes
collective
darted
breath.
past me,
Then the
searching.
judge dismissed the jury
papers.
to deliberate.
"Have you signed
The
them?"
hours that followed
His voice
felt like
was frantic.
years. His
I
hands
sat
shaking,
rigid.
every
I
nerve
forced
taut.
myself to stay
Shannon
calm,
at my side,
to
murmuring
tilt my head in
reassurances I
feigned
barely
confusion.
heard.
"I'm
Daniel
still
paced
looking
like a
them
caged
over,"
animal,
I said coolly,
his eyes darting
his
toward me
face
with
darkened.
venom. At
"There's
one
no
point,
time.
he leaned close enough
Do you
to sneer.
understand what's at
"Enjoy
stake?"
your victory lap." I let
"It
silence
won't
stretch,
last."
then
I didn't
smiled
flinch.
faintly. His
"Oh,
words no
I
longer
think I
had
understand
teeth.
better than
he
you
had
think.
already lost.
For a flicker of a
he
moment,
just didn't know
suspicion
it yet.
crossed his face,
But he shoved it down, too consumed by panic to see the trap closing. After he left, I put the next part of my plan into motion. I created anonymous email accounts, drafted cover letters, and attached the confession alongside supporting documents. The first recipients: investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The second: key board members of Daniel's firm. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble. But
When
as
the
I
jury
prepared
returned,
myself for
the
this
air
war,
was so thick
a
with
small
tension
part
it
of me
felt like the walls
hesitated.
themselves might
What
collapse.
if Clarissa was only
The
telling
foreperson
half the
rose,
story, holding the
what if
verdict
she was
slip with
protecting
trembling
herself
hands,
while
handing me just
We,
enough
the
to
jury,
burn Daniel?
find in favor
I
of the
thought back to
plaintiff
the fear in
Marissa
her
Caldwell.
eyes, the urgency
The
in her
words
voice,
echoed like thunder.
No, she
crashing
wasn't
through
lying.
every wall Daniel
She was
had tried to
terrified
build
because
around
she
his
knew
lies.
how ruthless
My
Daniel
breath
could be.
caught.
Tears
And if he
blurring my
realized
vision
she
as
had
the
spoken
judge
to
read
me,
the details.
she would be in as much
Restitution
danger as
for
I
the
was.
retirement funds,
That
spousal
realization
support,
lit a fire
and punitive
inside
damages
me.
for fraud.
This wasn't just
Daniel's
about
face
revenge
twisted
anymore.
into something monstrous.
It was about survival.
His fists
For
clenching
me,
white
for
as the
Clarissa,
courtroom erupted.
and for anyone else
He
who had been
slammed his hand
tangled
on
in
the
the
Daniel's
table,
web
shouting,
of lies.
"This is
That
rigged."
night,
I
before
lay awake in
officers stepped
bed,
forward to restrain
staring at
him,
the ceiling,
for the first
plotting my
time,
next
I saw
move.
him stripped bare.
I couldn't simply hand the
Desperate,
evidence over
furious,
and hope the
powerless.
system would protect me.
The man who once
Daniel
towered
was
over
too
my
clever,
life was now
too
nothing more than a
manipulative.
bitter shadow.
He'd twist the
Gee, my
narrative,
shoulder,
paint me as the
You did it,
unstable
Marissa.
wife.
The
She
bitter
whispered.
woman lashing out
You
after
finally
being
took
left.
your life back.
No, I had
The
to control
courtroom
the story.
emptied.
The chaos
I had to
spilling into
expose
the
him in a
halls
way that
outside
left
where
no
reporters
room for his
swarmed.
lies.
But for the
And I
first
knew
time,
just how to
I
do
wasn't
it.
afraid of the
My
questions.
plan would not
the
just
cameras,
destroy his
or the
career.
headlines.
It would strip
Let
him of
them
his
tell the
reputation,
story. His
It was
allies,
mine, and I
his
owned
carefully
every word of
crafted
it.
mask of
The days that
respectability.
followed moved
By
in a
the
blur.
time I was finished,
Headlines spread
Daniel
across
would be a
news
man the
outlets,
world turned its back
painting
on,
Daniel as the
begging
fraud
for
he
mercy
truly
he would
was.
never receive.
Victoria
As the
vanished
clock
from
ticked
public
past
view.
midnight, her
I
silence
opened
louder
my
than
laptop
any
and
defense
began
she could have
writing.
mustered.
Not
Daniel
letters,
lost his job,
not
his
petitions.
reputation,
A
and the last
confession.
remnants of respect
Only
he
it
had clung
wasn't
to.
mine.
Meanwhile,
It was Daniel's.
I began to rebuild.
Using the documents
I opened
Clarissa
a
had
savings
given me as
account
a
in my
guide.
name only,
I drafted a
met with
detailed
financial
account of his
advisors,
schemes,
and
written
even
as
signed
though
up
it
for
came
night
directly
classes
from
I had
him.
once abandoned
The
to
fake
support his
confession
career.
outlined
Every
forged
small
signature,
step felt like
every
laying
stolen
bricks on a
dollar,
new foundation.
every deception.
The fear
It
that
was
had once
damning,
gripped me
airtight.
every morning was gone.
By the time I
in its
finished,
place
my
my fingers
fingers
stronger,
ached.
sharper.
But my heart raced
A
with
woman who had learned to
anticipation.
rise from
This
ashes
wasn't
without
just
waiting for
evidence
rescue
anymore.
My wounds
This was a
hadn't
weapon,
disappeared,
sharp and
but they
ready
were
to be
no longer
unleashed.
chains. And when the
They
time
were
was
scars,
right,
proof of
Daniel wouldn't know
survival.
what hit him.
One evening,
but as I
weeks
saved the
after the
file
trial,
and shut the
I
laptop,
found myself standing
caught
on
my
my porch
reflection
at
in the
sunset,
darkened screen.
the sky awash
My
in
own
gold
eyes
and
stared
crimson.
back at me.
A knock
came
fierce
at my
and
door,
unflinching,
hesitant
for
but
years,
familiar.
I had been
when
the
I
quiet,
opened it,
dutiful
there
wife,
stood Daniel,
bending under the weight
disheveled,
of Daniel's
broken,
lies,
eyes hollow
now,
with
I was
desperation.
something else entirely.
Marissa,
a woman
he pleaded,
reborn
his
in
voice
fire
raw.
and betrayal.
I need your help.
A woman who wasn't
They're
just
going to
fighting
fire
back.
me unless you
She was
intervene.
rewriting the story.
Please. And
I've
as much
got
as Daniel
nothing
had hurt
left.
me,
As
the
much as he had
audacity of
stolen
it
from
left me speechless for
He
a
had
moment.
given me this one
This
gift
man
without
had drained my
realizing it.
retirement,
The strength
shattered
to
my
become his
trust,
greatest
dragged
downfall.
me through public
The morning
humiliation,
after drafting the
and here
confession,
he was,
I woke up
begging
with a
me to
pounding
save him.
heart.
The
I
kind
looked
that
into
comes
his
not
eyes
from
and
fear,
saw
but from
nothing but
anticipation.
emptiness.
The
You
sun
made
cut
your
across my
choices,
blinds in
I
sharp
said
stripes,
softly.
and for the
Now
first
you
time
live
in
with
months,
them.
I felt
His
clarity.
face crumpled.
My plan
Tears
wasn't
streaking
just an
down
idea.
his cheeks.
It was a
For the
storm
first
waiting
time,
to break.
I turned my
my back on him without guilt, sipping black coffee. And I closed the door, staring at the manila folder Daniel had left for me, dreamlessly. Inside were the documents he wanted me to sign. My heart lighter than it had been in years. The very news he thought he could slip around my neck without me noticing. Not just in court, I almost laughed at the arrogance. Daniel's downfall was not my triumph. I began making copies. It was a testament to every person who has been wronged, saving each file to encrypted or silenced and still found the strength to rise. Back into the folder as I sat by the window, watching
Daniel
the moon
would believe
cast
I
silver
was
light
still
over the
wavering.
quiet street. He would never see the knife I was holding behind my back. My story and see a reflection of their own shared my draft with. This wasn't just about revenge. I brought her to my kitchen. It was about reclaiming dignity, and slid the laptop across to her. She read silently. I knew, her eyes scanning every word. My story was bigger than Daniel. With each sentence, it was a beacon. Her lips tightened, and if you follow this journey with me, and finally, if you felt the laptop with the anger, the fire of justice, she said, and the sweet relief of victory, is brilliant. I want you to take something with you. It's risky, but never underestimate your own strength. I leaned forward, even when it feels buried under grief and betrayal. Do you think people will believe stories like this matter? Because they deserve to be told and heard. Marissa, I ask you, they won't just believe it. Please like this video. They'll share it with someone who needs courage. But we can't release it as is. You won't miss the next story of resilience and triumph. Things together, only Daniel would know. We can turn pain into power that make it undeniable, and silence into strength. My stomach dropped. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Because that meant I'd have to dig deeper into his life, into the shadows he thought I could never reach. That night, I crept into Daniel's abandoned study. It was the first time I'd been in there since he left. The air was stale, smelling faintly of his cologne, the one I used to love. His leather chair sat like a throne before the desk, the place where he must have plotted all his betrayals. I opened drawers, rifled through folders, and my breath caught when I found a slim black notebook hidden beneath stacks of financial journals. Inside were scribbled notes, dates, account numbers, phone call reminders. His handwriting, his shorthand, his secrets. One entry froze me. Cayman transfer, use M's signature if questioned. My blood ran cold. It was undeniable proof he had forged me into his schemes. My hands shook as I snapped photos of every page. For the first time, I wasn't just his wife uncovering betrayal. I was his executioner, piecing together his downfall. The next morning, Shannon helped me weave these details into the fake confession. Dates from his notebook, language he often used in emails, the kind of phrasing that would sound distinctly like him. It was terrifying how quickly the puzzle fit together, how easily I could slip into his voice. But it was also empowering. Every sentence I wrote was like driving another nail into the coffin of the man who had stolen my future. By the end of the day, the document was airtight. Shannon leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This isn't just a weapon, Marissa. This is nuclear. I stared at the pages glowing on the screen, a strange calm settling over me. I didn't just want Daniel ruined. I wanted him exposed, stripped bare for the world to see, no mask, no charm, just the monster he really was. 2 days later, Daniel showed up again, pounding on my door. His hair was unkempt, his tie missing, desperation carved into his face. Marissa, open the door. His voice cracked. I waited a full minute before unlocking it, just long enough to remind him who held the power now. When I finally opened it, his eyes darted past me, searching. The papers. Have you signed them? His voice was frantic, his hands shaking. I forced myself to stay calm, to tilt my head in feigned confusion. I'm still looking them over, I said coolly. His face darkened. There's no time. Do you understand what's at stake? I let silence stretch, then smiled faintly. Oh, I think I understand better than you think. For a flicker of a moment, suspicion crossed his face, but he shoved it down, too consumed by panic to see the trap closing. After he left, I put the next part of my plan into motion. I created anonymous email accounts, drafted cover letters, and attached the confession alongside supporting documents. The first recipients: investigative journalists known for tearing apart corporate scandals. The second: key board members of Daniel's firm. And the third, the most deliciously strategic, were rival companies who would leap at the chance to dismantle him. Each email was carefully timed, sent in intervals, like ticking bombs placed across the battlefield. By the time the first one exploded, Daniel wouldn't know where to run. He would be trapped, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. And I would be watching unseen, as his empire began to crumble.